Whatever happened during Reconstruction, and then up through the Jim Crow era, anything and everything that had to deal with the relationships between the blacks and the whites just went underground.
There's been a really good job of whitewashing a very awkward discussion.
It's a hugely awkward discussion.
Because if you know the history of the whole concept of whiteness, if you know the history of the whole concept of the white race, where it came from and for what reason, you know that it was a trick. And it's worked brilliantly. See, prior to the mid to late 1600s in the colonies of what would become the United States, there was no such thing as the white race. Those of us of European descent did not refer to ourselves by that term really ever before then. In fact, in the old countries of Europe, we had spent most of our time killing each other. We didn't love each other. We weren't one big happy family. The side of my family that comes from Scotland, hell, they didn't even worry about fighting people outside of Scotland. Highlanders and Lowlanders just fought the hell out of each other. So there was no white.
All right, so I want to get into this book. Very good book I found here. I'm glad I found this. It's called Bound Over, Indentured Servitude and American Conscience by John Van Dersey, forward by John Patrick Diggins. This is from 1985. And I just want to show real quick, this is in the back of the book, the sources, very scholarly book, primary sources. All right, you can see it's a very long list. White servitude in Pennsylvania, indentured and redemption labor in colony. I think we read that one. Like the theological origins of American Revolution, you know, and it keeps going to individual sources. All right. White Servitude in the Colony of Virginia. We've got that one before in the past, James, but James Bala, right? And it keeps going. Samuel Adams, Benjamin Franklin, an autobiography of Benjamin Franklin and selection from his other writings. So a lot of primary sources here from the time. Just wanted to show that. And this is in the introduction of the book. And it says here, what exactly was on the minds of the English, Irish, Scottish, German, and other immigrants when they said, let's get out, let's go to America? Thanks to John Van Dersey, Bound Over, his book that we're reading right now, we know now the reasons that prompted many Europeans to come to America and the conditions in which they arrived. Some were between 1/2 and 2/3 of all the colonists came to the New World as what? Voluntary what? Slaves, indentured servants. Well, they'll say that, voluntary, but we know, right, to dodge the hijack, we know a lot of them were getting kidnapped or convicted felons and all that, undesirables that were being sent over here. It says indentured servants, apprentices, tenants, bond servants, and the like, all agreeing to the status of redemptionnaire in one form or another, a person who, lacking the means, accepts free transportation as the price of 4 to 7 years of unrelenting servitude to an unknown master. Continuing the first introduction of this book, and it's talking about how certain colonists who actually indenture, it says here, started following the Whig Republican ideology. It says, in Bound Over, one finds evidence of Whig Republican ideology among colonial leaders who had experienced indentured servitude. Colonial leaders who had what? Gone through what? That form of slavery, right? Servitude, indentured servitude, suspicion of power, distrust of wealth, and the corruption of luxury, and a fear that America would relapse into an old world bondage. Indeed, it might be said that Americans who had endured the arbitrary power of farming or merchant master had even more reason to believe that every assertion of British authority brought America closer to a return to indentured servitude, a system of power relations that colonists had once accepted as necessity, but now came to be seen as a curse from the past. All right, so they're trying to let you know a lot of these so-called American revolutionists, these abolitionists, all these people, there's a history behind them. Many of them were what? They had experienced indentured servitude. So they weren't just fighting for freedom for nothing. As Van der Sea makes clear, memories of servitude weighed heavily on the minds of leaders like Tom Paine, Benjamin Franklin, Joseph Galloway, and Alexander Hamilton. All right, big one right there, right? So, right, I did a video, right, on Benjamin Franklin. He was an indentured servant. He was a servant to his dad, supposedly. And he ran away. He was a runaway slave, basically. He was a runaway slave. That's why he ran away, because he was treated like property. Benjamin Franklin. Now, they're letting us know here, Alexander Hamilton, Joseph Galloway, and Tom Paine as well. These people were all indentured servants. But it remains to be considered whether those who had once felt the tyranny of servitude would emerge as classical Republicans dedicated to civic duty or economic liberals aspiring to individual opportunity. It says, in any event, Van der Sea shows how the experience of indentured servitude made many Americans not only suspicious of British rule, but keenly aware of man's tendency to exploit fellow men, an attitude deeply felt in the debates over the Constitution and continuing into the Civil War itself. What Lincoln learned from the Bible, his successor, remember Lincoln, the so-called Negro, Lincoln, President Andrew Johnson, an ex-indentured servant. Oh, Andrew Johnson, and what an ex-indentured servant learned from personal experience. This book is an attempt to recall, before they too are lost to us, the names and lives of America's age of servitude. It is, at best, a beginning. From such an enormous enterprise, so sweeping a social transformation, the great bulk of information remains to be extracted. It is from among the yet undiscovered diaries, from the court records, and from reminiscences filed perhaps under other categories. We're talking about primary sources here, still to be examined by students and scholars with the necessary time, grants, and academic affiliations, that the story of our national time of bondage will be completed. All right, it's telling you it's a whole history that hasn't been told. All right, so I wanted to read this article. I actually found it in this publication of the Ebony magazine. It's actually from the 60s. It's actually from 1969, November 1969, issue of that year in Time. All right, and it had an interesting article. And they have an article here, right? It says The Birth of Black America, Part 2. It says White Servitude in America by Lerone Bennett Jr. All right, Lerone, let's see what you wrote in 1969. You were educating everybody back in 1969. This probably would have seemed crazy to everybody. All right, now remember 1969 mentality when we're reading this article, right? Again, we got to dodge the hijack because a lot of these Europeans were not just white. They were people of color, melanated, Europeans, what you would call a negro, Scottish, or black Irish, black Scots, black Britons, black Germans, Swarthy French, Swarthy Danish, whatever you want to call them. Basically, 1969, he knows Europeans were being sent over here. So he, in his mind, they all must be white because we were taught that everybody was white in Europe that was coming over here. So we know how to dodge the hijack, but either way, we're going to pull out the babies out of this, and it's going to correlate with what we've been learning, right? This is part 4 of White Servitude, Black Masters, right? So we start here. It says, when someone removes the cataracts of whiteness from our eyes, and when we look with unclouded vision on the bloody shadows of the American past, we will recognize for the first time that the Afro-American, so-called Afro-American, all right, 1969, we already know you're not African. All right, so we're going to continue. It says, who was so often second in freedom, was also second in slavery. Second in slavery, okay? Indeed, it will be revealed that the so-called Afro-American or the so-called Negro was third in slavery. We're going to start switching that up. Every time we're going to see that Afro, I'm going to say the indigenous, the American indigenous, the indigenous American. For he inherited his chains in a manner of speaking from the pioneer bondsmen who were red and white. All right, so he's saying what? He got slavery from white and red people. That's what he's saying. The story of this succession of how the red bondsmen and the white bondsmen passed on the torch of forced labor to the black bondsmen, and of how white men created a system of white servitude which lasted in America for more than 200 years. The story of how this system was created and why, of how white men and white women and white children were bought and sold like cattle and transported across the seas in foul slave ships. The story of how all this happened, of how the white planter reduced white people to temporary and lifetime servitude before stretching out his hands to Ethiopia. All right, so they're saying, he's letting you know, this author in Ebony, 1969, he knows there's at least a documented history here of indentured servants coming in from Europe for at least 200 years. And then he's saying that how this whole system was passed over to only people of color, or what he's saying, the Ethiopian, or reaching out to Ethiopian, meaning people of color. Burnt, right? What is the etymology of the Ethiop? Burnt face, or dark-skinned person. All right, so he's saying has never been told before in all dimensions. So this white servitude, he's saying, has never been told. 1969, right? As a matter of fact, the traditional embalmers of American experience seem to find white servitude enormously embarrassing and prefer to dwell at length on black bondage in America. Oh, isn't that the story we grew up with, right? We're finding out, this is part 4, but even before this, we already knew, your grandma already knew, you were the American Indian, and so, first of all, you didn't come from Africa. So that whole Kunta Kinte thing, we know it's a fictional story. We know he got sued for plagiarizing the book called The African, Alex Haley. He had to pay $600,000 back in the 70s. That would be a lot of money today. And they still continuing the lie, even though it was a fictional story. All right, so we know how to dodge the hijack. We know that, again, this system was passed over to the person of color. His indenture was being extended longer, eventually becoming chattel. But this started out with what? With Europeans as indentured servants, with Europeans as indentured servants. For white bondage and red bondage are the missing legs in the triangle of American servitude. And this triangle defines the initial American experience as an experiment in compulsion. Both red and white bondage were integral parts of this experiment. but white bondage was particularly important in this first place. White bondage lasted for more than 2 centuries and involved a majority of the white immigrants to the American colonies. It has been estimated that at least 2 out of every 3 white colonists worked for a term of years in the fields or kitchens as semi-slaves, all right? What? That out of 2 out of every 3, that's almost all of them, right? 2 out of every 3 European that came here was an indentured servant. He had to work almost as a slave, like treated as a slave. We got this before, right? This is part 4. For a term of years. Remember, an indenture, a contract. A second point of immense importance in this whole equation is the fact that white servitude was the historic foundation upon which the system of black and within the perspective of system of white bondage in America. How did the system develop and why? It developed primarily because of a desperate need for labor. The opening of the New World created a need for labor, which brought to the surface Europe's ancient Athens and enduring the Third Reich fascination with unfree labor. It has been suggested that the white man's sense of humanity kept him from enslaving white people, but as Eric Williams has said, there is no evidence of this sense of humanity in the record. The white founding fathers needed labor. They were willing to do anything to get labor. They didn't care what color that labor was, or what religion it professed, or what country it came from. Again, they didn't care what color. They didn't care what color or what country. They didn't just go to Africa. They didn't just go get people of color. That's a whole false story. When they needed free labor, they got all the unwanted, undesirables, all the convicts, all the criminals. Remember? This is what they were doing. All the poor people, all the children, all the vagabonds, all the prostitutes. Remember, we read this before. They didn't go to Africa to get people of color only. And they didn't care what religion you were.
So there was no white race, but in the colonies of what would become the United States, what did we see in the 1660s, 1670s? We began to see that Africans of indentured servant status, many of them not enslaved yet, they were not necessarily permanently enslaved. Some were, others were indentured like many poor Europeans for periods of 7 to 11 years. They could work off their indenture and then they would be free labor technically. Realized, as did the white indentured servants, the Europeans who hadn't even been called white yet, that they had a lot of things in common, like the fact that they were all getting their clock cleaned by the elite. And so they would get together more than our history books taught us, to foment rebellion against the elite, to try to get a better deal for themselves on the basis of economic necessity and economic justice. And what did the elite do? When you see that you're outnumbered by black and white folks who are penniless, landless, peasants, you have to do one of 2 things. You either have to kill them all, but you can't do that because who's going to work? Rich folks weren't going to. They had to get poor people to work. The whole point was to be a person of leisure back in those days. That was the goal, was not to work. So you couldn't kill them all. You didn't want to kill them all. You had to do the work yourself. You had to build your own levee, build your own house. No. Pick your own tobacco, harvest your own cotton. No, we're not going to do any of that. So you can't kill them, but you can co-opt them. And so the elite in Virginia, for example, in the colony, begins to give certain carrots to people of European descent, saying things like, you know, we're going to let you own a little land, not much, but just a little. And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. Now you're free labor. And by the way, once you're free labor, you get 50 acres of land just because you're free labor, see? So we're going to cut you in on this deal. We're going to let you enter into contracts. We're going to let you testify in court. And here's the best of all, we're going to put you on the slave patrol to keep those people in line, right? The idea was you're still going to get your clock clean. We still don't like you. We still aren't going to really empower you or change your economic subordination, but we're going to make you honorary members of this team, and you're going to help us keep those other people down. And so they got a little taste of power, and it did effectively divide and conquer those coalitions. Those rebellions began to stop almost instantly. Fast forward to the Civil War era, you have rich white folks in the South, where I come from, standing up and openly admitting that the reason they're prepared to secede from the Union, and the only reason they ever articulated publicly, ever, was to maintain and extend slavery and white supremacy not only where it already existed, but into the newly acquired, that is to say, stolen territories from Mexico to the west. That was what they said. Now we lie about it. We say it wasn't about slavery, that it was about states' rights. Yes, the right of the states to keep and maintain slaves, exactly. But back then they had no shame, so they didn't try and cover it up. They openly said it, but once again, the rich didn't want to go do the work. Are you kidding? No. They're going to get poor people to go fight for them. And the poor folks didn't even own slaves. Now think, how do you get poor people who don't even own the shirt on their back, let alone slaves, to go fight to keep your slaves for you? You've got to convince them that their skin is more important than their economic interest, because...
I want to read from this book now. It's called The Peopling of British North America, an introduction by Bernard Bailyn. All right, he has a lot of good sources for his information. We're going to get into this book now. It says here, as I suggested earlier, the original recruitment of the 17th century population was largely, though not wholly, the product of efforts to divert to the colonies a portion of the mobile English labor force. Reliable estimates of the numbers involved have now been established: 378,000 immigrants from England to the Western Hemisphere in the course of the 17th century, of whom 155 went to the mainland colonies. The majority of them, indentured servants. They wasn't here just because they wanted a free ride over here and start a new life. They didn't pay their own way over here. These were indentured servants / slaves. So they're saying that in the 17th century alone, just from England, 378,000. Remember, they don't really have the exact numbers, right? These are all estimates. There's a lot more probably going on, a lot more. And this is just in 1700. And they told us that when we look at the numbers now they're telling us that only about 300,000 slaves actually entered North America, right? That were so-called negro. But they're telling us right here, just in the 17th century alone, just from England alone, 378,000 immigrants. All right. So what we're saying, where's all the Africans? And we know something of their geographical origin. Almost all of the indentured servants came from southern England, with a high concentration in the Thames Valley, centered in London. Their social origins are less clear, but there are fairly clear boundaries. These 17th century labor migrants form a spectrum from the utterly destitute, the disreputable, and the vagrant to the respectable young artisans or would-be artisans seeking more secure employment and eventually an independent stake in the land. All right, so they try to sugarcoat it, but they told you a little bit. They're undesirables, they're destitute, they're disreputable and vagrant. That's what they were sending over here. In these later years of the colonial period, their numbers were supplemented by convicts from all over Britain. About 50,000 of them were transported to America to serve out their time in unpaid labor, along with the free indentured servants. There were Irish and Scotch too among the 18th century labor recruits, and above all, a mass of German redemptioners whose presence, like that of the Irish, was a major fact of social life everywhere in North America, from Lunenburg in Nova Scotia to the southern borderlands of Georgia and Florida. All right, all these countries sending their undesirables, all these indentured servants from different parts of Europe. Bound Over, Indentured Servitude and American Conscience by John Van Dersey. Introduction. On November 30th, 1774, the brig London Packet docked at Philadelphia. Its chief cargo, not usual for the time, all right, not usual for the time, we're talking about 1774, right, was 122 indentured servants, British and continental men and women, who would be bound into servitude for an average of 4 years in exchange for passage. Probably some had agreed to a certain term in England. Others would have to bargain with agents, masters or ship owners here. A certain number may have been transported for criminal offenses. A few may have been kidnapped or shanghaied by unscrupulous labor contractors. All of these were common practices in the American servant trade. The American servant trade. All right, we're not talking about Africans here. We're talking about that in 1774. It was the usual thing to see ships come in full of people, full of indentured servants, ships, full ships, right? Servant ships or slave ships, what do you want to call it? Huh? They were packed in there like herons. Remember, this is part 4. and continuing is going to corroborate. Now listen to this. Except for the important distinction that their existence as individuals was acknowledged by law, and that after their term of servitude they were to be granted the full rights of free men and women, the status of these people was essentially the same as that of slaves. Again, the status of these people was essentially the same as that of slaves. This is slave. This is how slavery became. Should tell. It was through indentured servitude. They were extending these indentures for life. They, the work they did, and the clothes on their backs belonged entirely to their masters. They could be hired out, sold, or auctioned, even if this meant separating them from their families. They could be beaten, whipped, or branded, all right? This is where you get that whole story. Indentured servitude, these people went through that. If they ran away, they could be punished. By an extension, often a multiplication of their term of servitude. In some colonies, runaways were hanged, a process too wasteful to apply to slaves, who retained, after all, the value of capital. The resemblance to enslavement began at least at embarkation, where both voluntary and involuntary immigrants were herded on board. White Guinea men, it says they're white Guinea men, and crammed below decks in unsanitary conditions with insufficient provisions. This is the Middle Passage here. Again, Middle Passage. They're crossing the Atlantic Ocean from Europe, and these conditions. All right, we're going to ignore this. You want to make up stories like Kunta Kinte. You want to put it, oh, it was Africans. It was all these Negroes. No, these are Europeans, both pale skin and melanated Europeans as well, colored Europeans together. They were what? Being packed in these ships, crammed below decks in unsanitary conditions with insufficient provisions. On the London packet, this had meant 9 weeks of confinement in a stifling hold, 9 weeks in the ocean, a Middle Passage, in a stifling hold, and an outbreak of putrid fever that had swept through the entire ship. 5 bodies had been thrown overboard en route, and no more than 5 people among the complement of indentured cabin passengers and crew had escaped infestation. You hear this? We've gotten these reports in past videos and the past parts and different sources of the conditions of the people. People will comment on my videos, on these type of videos especially, be like, but it's not the same. Nobody's comparing, first of all, but these people went through the same thing that you supposedly Kunta Kinte went through. Supposedly, that's a fictional story, and I'm reading you a real story right now. All right, so we're going to continue now. Remember, they're talking about the ship that came in with all these people, and it says among the deceased cabin passengers was a marginally free man, a failed schoolmaster, staymaker, and preacher, who had barely been able to scrape together the price of his passage. In this atmosphere of incarceration, disease, and fortified human rights, he made his passage to the New World, an appendage of a practice developed for the population of it. Such passage, remember this Middle Passage, right? Middle Passage was a fearful demonstration of the fragility of human freedom, as well as the fierce price of slipping back into servitude. The experience was to mark the man, just as the disease festering among the indentured below deck marked him now, leaving him so weakened that he had to be carried off the ship, disembarking only after the rest of the passengers and crew had left. Thus, Thomas or Tom Paine arrived in America. All right, they're talking about Thomas Paine. Who's this Tom Paine? He came in under these conditions. Who's Thomas Paine that came in under the slave conditions? We're going to go to Britannica Encyclopedia.com or Britannica.com, and it's Thomas Paine, it says here, right? Now, Thomas Paine, it says here, born in Norfolk, England. He died in 1809, New York. English-American writer and political pamphleteer whose Common Sense pamphlet and Crisis papers were important influences on the American Revolution. So he contributed to the American Revolution, the same person who came in as a slave, remember, under those conditions that he had to be carried off the ship. He almost died on the way over here. It says here, Paine arrived in Philadelphia on November 30th, 1774. All right. Bash introduced him to Robert Atkin, whose Pennsylvania magazine Paine helped found and edit for 18 months. Now it says here, look, November 30, 1774, he arrived there, right? Now back in the book we were reading, right? bound over. What does it say? This London packet, this ship arrived when? November 30th, 1774, right? November 30th, 1774. Same time, right? But over here it's telling us the conditions he came under. He was an indentured servant, almost died. Those horrible conditions. He came in through that middle passage. But Encyclopedia Britannica doesn't mention any of him being an indentured servant or slave or anything like that. And you know why? Because this is the image that we have of him. And we go to Wikipedia. This is what they show us. Thomas Paine was an English-born American political activist, philosopher, political theorist, and revolutionary. He authored the two most influential pamphlets at the start of the American Revolution. All right? Nothing about him being a slave, an indentured servant. All right? But if a person of color, a known person of color, would have came in under the same status, he would have been called a slave all of history. And that's what happened with the first 20-odd Negroes. They were the same status as this person, indentured servants. But they were slaves, and they were known as slaves the rest of their lives, even though they got their freedoms just like him and had land and owned slaves and were successful just like this person right here. All right, so we continue in this book. And right here it talks about how Washington basically liked this guy Thomas Paine's readings or his literature, what he wrote. And it says Washington, we're talking about George Washington, moved by this article, ordered it to be read aloud to his brigades. He too, plantation owner, slaveholder, aristocrat, had been associated with indentured servitude. All right, let's get the drop right here about Washington in this. It says Washington was named after an indentured servant. Again, Washington was named after an indentured servant. All right, what? George Eskridge. All right, if you don't know, we're gonna do an in-depth video about this and his genealogy, because I'm, tracing down who he really is, Washington. All right, and so in this book, it's just letting us know that supposedly his name was given to him by an indentured servant. Well, after an indentured servant, George Eskridge, the legal guardian, listen to this, of George Washington's mother, and for many years a member of the Virginian House of Burgesses. So they're talking about that this same George Eskridge was actually the legal guardian, or basically the master of George Washington's mother. I believe Mary Ball, her name is Mary Ball. So he was given to her legally at 13, and he had her since all the way till 22 years old, George Eskridge. Now they're gonna say legal guardian. They're trying to sugarcoat it, but in reality, that sounds like she was indentured over to him, and supposedly his mom, or her mom, sorry, Mary Ball, his grandmother, George Washington's grandmother, wrote in her will that she wanted to give him, this George Eskridge, a good friend, right? It says a good friend, legal ownership of her daughter from 13 to 22 years old. And to me, that sounds like an indenture, all right? Apprenticeship, indenture, whatever you want to call it. But we've already read so much about how they were doing this to children, and parents had to indent their kids out to, for certain reasons, to pay up certain things or whatever. And so this sounds like an indenture. This is George Washington's mother being indentured again to this George Eskridge, who supposedly was the source of George's name, an indentured servant himself. And I know it sounds weird that an indentured servant would own somebody, but he owned her supposedly after he was freed from his indenture after 8 years of working as an indentured servant / slave. So he was named after a slave, right? George was named after a slave. They're trying to sugarcoat all this stuff. It's the same thing. Like in history, they would have said slave, but now he's an indentured servant, right? Because they don't want to taint George Washington's name. So it says that this George Eskridge, right, was kidnapped. He had been kidnapped as a boy in Wales and sold in Virginia, where after serving out his term, he angrily tore up his hearthstone bed with a mattock. He used to sleep on that, right next to the fire. They had him sleeping on the floor and all that, He was treated really bad, actually, if you read his story. Again, we're going to do a future video on that. He was treated just like a slave, the stories you hear about the mistreatment, all that. Same guy that they named George Washington after. Right, and so again, he got his freedom after his indenture. Supposedly he was kidnapped when he was a boy in England. Remember, they were doing that, right? There was so many people spiriting or kidnapping children, people all over the place and sending them to the Americas. So he was an example of that. And he actually was an important person in when it comes to George Washington's life, right? Crazy. So it says, according to Jonathan Butcher, the Maryland rector who tutored Washington's stepson, Washington himself owed what rudimentary education he received to a convict servant named Hobby, a convict servant. All right, convict servant, a slave, an indentured servant slash slave named Hobby. Hobby, I bet you he was a colored person who tutored him in reading, writing, and keeping accounts. Now remember, all these convicts and supposed servants were coming from Europe. All right, as a Virginia planter and early colonial industrialist, Washington had bought and used indentured labor. All right, remember my video I just did about George Washington? He had basically all indentured servants. He didn't have no so-called African slaves, or he had all indentured servants working in his plantation. Very few, if any like real people being held as chattel for life. He actually had a lot of so-called, what we say, white servants or slaves in his plantation, and colored people, right? And these colored people, again, we already know in history because they used to always show him, walking around and all these, what they tell, black so-called African slaves. But in reality, he only really had mostly indentured servants from Europe. So who were these colored people in reality? Is what I'm trying to explain to you. Hopefully you guys understand that by now. Now it says here, but he insisted on redemptioners, people who accepted bondage in exchange for passage rather than transported criminals or people spirited away by kidnappers. And he specified that families not be separated. As a British officer in the French and Indian War, Washington had urged upon the colonial authorities the enlistment of servants in the Virginia volunteers, warning that if such provision were not made, servants would run off and enlist in the regular army anyway. He himself recruited numbers of indentured servants for his regiment. All these Europeans, who they fighting? All right, who they going after? In a country desperately short of skilled labor, with work to be done in almost every direction one looked, these were not inexpensive principles. In 1784, Washington issued a request to purchase the terms of skilled joiners or bricklayers, which, beyond his personal reservations about criminality and the sundering of families, displays the desperate ecumenism of the short-handed manager. I would not confine you to the Palatines or Germans. Remember the Palatines? If they are good workmen, they may be from Asia, Africa, or Europe. They may be Mahometans, Muslims, Jews, or Christians of any sect, or they may be atheists. He didn't care. Basically, what they're saying, he was all about not bringing anybody to his plantation that was a criminal or kidnapped, but he didn't care when it came to needing labor for bricklaying, right, or building stuff, right, like construction workers or whatever, masons, architects, whatever. He didn't care what they were. He was saying, I don't really mind if they're whatever, all these things he named, basically anybody. It says, from Washington, the landed aristocrat, to Paine, the newly arrived indigent immigrant, there were few colonial Americans untouched by the practice of indentured servitude. All right, big one right there. They're letting you know that the history that they didn't tell us, and now what I'm going to start showing you guys little by little. It's a lot of info, so hopefully we can do a lot of videos on this. But they're letting you know that these early colonial Americans, they were somehow involved with indentured servitude, whether they were a slave or they were involved into it, bringing people or enslaving people under that, taking advantage of the head right system, bringing massive indentured servants, and gained a lot of acres because of that. All right, so again, I'm going to investigate whether Washington, what kind of, because they said he landed here an aristocrat. So what aristocrat family is he coming from? And why was his mom indented to this indentured servant? Who is this indentured servant, George? And why is he named that? Is this really his dad? Is this his real dad? Why did he name after him? Why did his mom give his daughter over to him? And she was an indentured servant. So how aristocrat is he? So, we're going to dig into all of this. Continues, says, it was the state of destitution most immediate to everyone. They're talking about indentured servitude in the American colonies that came. The while less prison and poorhouse, the condition that could reclaim you no matter how far or how fast you fled it, as much a New World product as corn or the potato. It haunted the colonial imagination, found voice in the works of Defoe and Smollett, Goldsmith and Richardson, and later Stevenson and Scott. It gave to words like liberty, freedom, and tyranny a physical reality that people were willing to suffer and die for. Do you understand what they're telling you right here? All right, so all those wars for liberty, freedom, like the Revolutionary War, Civil Wars, and all those liberties, all these people, all these abolitionists, all these so-called Europeans caring for liberty and freedom, but at the same time got the so-called Negro still under tyranny. So it was specific things, and they were basically talking about their experience too, not just the so-called Negroes' experience or Aboriginal American Indian. And a lot of these, again, Europeans included people of color. These famous black abolitionists, we gotta really dig into who they really were and do their genealogy. See how American they were. All right, and why, or even if they were part, European, that tells you, their indentured servitude, their experience is why they were, like people like Benjamin Franklin, right? He was an indentured servant. We're gonna get more into that, but that was just an example. So it was a physical reality that people were willing to suffer and die for. It wasn't just because they felt bad for Africans. It was part of their life. They went through it too. They were going through it. They were the labor coming in. They were the servants. They were the so-called slaves coming in, being shipped in. The rest of them were already here. The American Indians were already here, getting enslaved or getting put into indentured servitude. You get it? It is the forgotten social undercurrent of the American Revolution. All right? This is the true reason of the American Revolution. Indentured servitude and all these Europeans fighting to fight their status and for their freedom, their liberty, and the tyranny they were under indentured servitude. The desperate sucking tide that made the unthinkable challenge to the most powerful naval and military force on earth a worthwhile risk, and prompted the guarantees of individual rights written into government that evolved afterwards. We are, in fact, as Americans, listen to what he's going to say, we are, in fact, as Americans, the descendants of bound people. All these Americans, all these white Americans, all these people talking about love it or leave it, or, this is the America, get out or go back to Africa, all that stuff. They are the ones descended from bound people. I've been showing you a lot. Again, this is part 4, right? In the other videos, how many hours in the other videos? How many sources did I show? And I got more sources on this part, and I got way more to show. I don't know how many parts I'm going to do because it just keeps popping up because it is part of history. I keep finding this. It's part of history. It's real history. History they never told us about. History they sugarcoated. History they whitewashed. History they erased. History they hid. Because the fact is that most Americans are descendants of bound people. And we're not talking about the original people here that were never, ever bound. Tied now by that binding in ways we have forgotten, which it would serve us well to remember. They're gonna remember now. Oh, they're gonna hear it now. They're gonna remember now. Ain't no turning back. From 1609 until well after the founding of the Republic, half of all the colonists who came to America arrived under some form of involuntary labor. And they're being modest here with these numbers. Half of all the colonists? How much millions is that? Do the numbers. Now times that times all their descendants that are alive today. How they multiplied and they call themselves the white, so-called white American, or what you want to call so-called black American. A lot of the so-called black Americans are descendants of the same European-bound people of color. People of North Africa, Sephardic Jews they didn't want, Huguenots they didn't want, black Germans they didn't want, Protestants, Quakers, swarthy, I'm talking about swarthy complexion Europeans. Yes, you can't deny that part if it's in your genealogy. actually look into it and see what else you can dig on it. Remember, America is the source anyways. Remember, especially for a lot of the people in the British Isles or the in the region of the United Kingdom. A lot of ancient tribes from there actually originated in America. So that's, we're gonna dig on that in future videos as well. So either way, we gotta accept every part of you. If you have whatever you have in your family, you gotta cherish it and understand it. Know who you are, because again, from 1609 until way after, till basically ever until today, half of all the colonists supposedly came in as involuntary labor. To them fell the largest share of the hardest work in an unfamiliar country. They cleared the land again. All right, this is a very scholarly book. There's so many sources in this. I already showed you in the beginning before I read it. It's on the way in the back. You want to, again, verify all the info. It's called Bound Over, Indentured Servitude and American Conscience. All right, that's the name of the book. You can check out all the sources he has. You can verify all the information. We have already verified the information we're reading in this book. This is part 4. But I want you to pay attention to what he's going to say. And what he just said, he said, to them, to who? To these indentured servants, these convicts, these undesirables, these people they didn't want over there, political prisoners. All right, all of them, all these indentured servants, to them fell the largest share of the hardest work in an unfamiliar country. The hardest work, not to Africans. The hardest work fell to indentured servants from Europe. They cleared what? The land, drained the swamps, built the roads, first plowed the unbroken ground. They cooked and cleaned and nursed and midwifed. They worked and died in greater numbers than anyone else. Theirs were the hands and backs that worked the transformation from wilderness to settled prosperity, a change so sweeping that its signs have vanished, so that the completed colonies seem somehow to have sprung fully into being directly from their charters. In the process, these men and women, drifters and convicts, rogues and whores, and the chronically poor, reluctant, coerced, unpaid, overworked, overwhelmingly ignorant, and unskilled, vanished themselves, transformed into what we have come to think as of the American people. Any questions? All right, that was so deep right there. I hope you understand. This is the main point I've been trying to show you. All right, and I hope you guys have been understanding the last 3 parts of this. When I was saying the invention of the white race and how they created this segregation. Today, all these American people, right? All these American people, a lot of these American people descend from indentured servants, both pale skin and people of color. So when we're reading, don't just think white when I'm saying they worked the hardest jobs and all this. There's also colored people in this. When they're saying, because you know how we grew up, and everybody always knew that it was the so-called slave, right, that built everything. The so-called slave, the Negro, right, so-called Negro or African slaves. Oh, they built the White House, they built the roads, right? Well, it was slaves / indentured servants, and there was so-called Negroes in that mix, but there was also pale-skinned people, Europeans. To them fell the hardest work. To your Europeans who were coming here as indentured servants, both pale-skinned and so-called Negro. And with time, they vanished themselves. What happened to them? They transformed into what we have come to think as the American people. But you want to keep associating yourself to being a slave or to everything that is slavery, everything related to slavery. That's what you keep wanting to associate yourself with, right? You want to identify as the persons who built the roads, who had to enslave, who had to go through all this hardship. That's what they want you to envision. But a lot of your ancestors were never even indentured servants or slaves, and owned land and actually owned indentured servants. So this is just something for you to think about. Again, we're in the book Bound Over, Indentured Servitude and American Conscience.
They came as slaves, vast human cargo, transported on tall British ships, bound for the Americas. They were shipped by the hundreds of thousands and included men, women, and even the youngest of children. Whenever they rebelled or even disobeyed an order, they were punished in the harshest of ways. Slave owners would hang their human property by their hands and set their hands or feet on fire as one form of punishment. They were burned alive and had their heads placed on pikes in the marketplaces as warnings to other captives. Now, do we really need to go into all the gory details? We know all too well of the atrocities of the African slave trade. But are we talking about the African slave trade? King James II and Charles I also led a continued effort to enslave the Irish. Britain's famed Oliver Cromwell furthered this practice of dehumanizing one's next-door neighbor. The Irish slave trade began when James II sold 30,000 Irish prisoners as slaves to the New World. His proclamation of 1625 required Irish political prisoners to be sent overseas and sold to English settlers in the West Indies. By the mid-1600s, the Irish were the main slaves sold to Antigua and Montserrat. At that time, 70% of the total population of Montserrat were Irish slaves. Ireland quickly became the biggest source of human livestock for English merchants. The majority of the early slaves to the New World were actually white, something many people aren't taught in their school. From 1641 to 1652, over 500,000 Irish were killed by the English, and another 300,000 were sold as slaves. Ireland's population fell from about 1.5 million to 600,000, just in one single decade. Families were ripped apart as the British did not allow Irish fathers to take their wives or children with them across the Atlantic. This led to a helpless population of homeless women and children. Britain's solution was to auction them off as well. During the 1650s, over 100,000 Irish children between the ages of 10 and 14 were taken from their parents and sold as slaves in the West Indies, Virginia, and New England. In this decade, 52,000 Irish, mostly women and children, were sold to Barbados and Virginia. Another 30,000 Irish men and women were also transported and sold to the highest bidder. In 1656, Cromwell ordered that 2,000 Irish children be taken to Jamaica and sold as slaves to English settlers. Many people today will avoid calling the Irish slaves what they truly were, slaves. They'll come up with terms like indentured servants. This is to describe what occurred to the Irish. However, in most cases, from the 17th and 18th centuries, Irish slaves were nothing more than human cattle. If a planter whipped or branded or beat an Irish slave to death, it was never a crime. A death was nothing more than a monetary setback. England continued to ship tens of thousands of Irish slaves for more than a century. Records state that after 1798, the Irish Rebellion, thousands of Irish slaves were sold to both America and Australia. One British ship even dumped 1,302 slaves into the Atlantic Ocean so that the crew could have plenty of food to eat. There's little question that the Irish experienced the horrors of slavery as much, if not more, in the 17th century as the Africans did. There is also very little question that those brown tan faces you witness in your travels to the West Indies are very likely a combination of Irish and African ancestry. In 1839, Britain finally decided on its own to end its participation in Satan's highway to hell and stop the transporting of slaves. While their decision did not stop pirates from doing what they desired, the new law slowly concluded. This chapter of nightmarish Irish misery. But if anyone, black or white, believes that slavery was only an African experience, then they have it completely wrong. Irish slavery is a subject worth remembering, not erasing from our memories. But where are our public and private schools? Where are the history books? Why is it so seldomly discussed? Do the memories of hundreds of thousands of Irish victims merit more than a mention from an unknown writer? Or is their story to be one that their English pirates intended, to, unlike the African book, have the Irish story utterly and completely disappeared as if it never existed? None of the Irish victims ever made it back to their homeland to describe their ordeal. These are the lost slaves, the ones that time and biased history books conveniently forgot. If you want to know more about this subject, I honestly say that you should really check it out, as I found everything that I read today from Google. It was very easy to search. I just typed in white slavery and started reading. And there's so much on this subject, but yet so little is taught in schools about it. It makes me wonder if really there is some kind of cover-up. From or by who, I don't know, but it's just another story of untold history. And it certainly is hidden.
The Ebony magazine from 1969. In other words, white servitude was the historic proven ground for the mechanisms of control and subordination used on the indigenous American people. The plantation pass system, the fugitive slave law, the use of the overseer and the house servant and the Uncle Tom, the forced separation of parents and children on the auction block, and the sexual exploitation of servant women, the whipping post, the slave chains, and the branding iron. All these mechanisms were tried out and perfected first on white men and white women. First, masters also developed a theory of internal white racism and used the traditional sambo and minstrel stereotypes to characterize white servants who were said to be good-natured and faithful, but biologically inferior and subject to laziness, immorality, and crime. And all this would seem to suggest that nothing substantial can be said about the mechanisms of black bondage in America, except against the background of and reflected internal tensions and contradictions in Europe. These tensions and contradictions revolved around certain ideas relating to the proper subordination and social segregation of white people, mercantilist ideas about national power and Lebensraum for the masses, and a new milieu of competitive egoism growing out of the Renaissance and the commercial revolution. And flowing with and out of all this was a new spirit of adventure and ruthlessness, which included a certain contempt for human beings of whatever color, especially if they were poor and defenseless, and a willingness to use any and every expedient in the quest for gold, glory, and conquest for God. All right, so whatever color, especially if they were poor and defenseless. They didn't care of the complexion. It was in this setting of social nightmare that England embarked on its career of colonialism. As so many scholars have suggested, one of the major causes of this movement was the idea that England needed a dumping ground for its undesirables. Velasco, the Spanish minister to England, said as much in a 1611 letter to his monarch. Their principal reason for colonizing these parts is to give an outlet for so many idle, wretched people as they have in England, and thus prevent the dangers that might be feared of them. You see, you hear in this 1611 a letter, they're like, yo, the main reason of why we got to get these colonies established, basically, they're saying they're establishing these penal colonies, right? To get rid of the so many idle, wretched people that they have in England. However, that might be the fact remains that the idle wretched people became the first fodder of colonialism, and they played this role under a system of forced labor with deep roots in European experience. By this time, of course, the institution of slavery had virtually died out in Europe, but other forms of forced labor, including the apprenticeship system, were common. And when the opening of the New World created a demand which free labor could not satisfy, the colonists created a system of forced labor based loosely on the old apprenticeship system under the new system called Indentured Servitude. All right, Indentured Servitude. A person sold himself or was sold for a stipulated number of years, usually from 207. Although some were sold into lifetime slavery, lifetime, it became lifetime to pay the cost of his transportation to America. The indentured servant, as the white bondsmen were called, signed a contract of indenture in England or America. There were other servants called redemptioners who were given transportation on the basis of their promise to pay the captain on their arrival in an American port. If the redemptioner could not arrange to pay the captain either by borrowing the money from a friend or relative or by selling himself or members of his family, he was sold by the ship captain. The ranks of white servitude also included convicts who were sentenced to terms of service, usually 7 to 14 years, all right, convicts, in the colonies in lieu of prison sentences, kidnapped men, women, and children, husbands fleeing wives, wives fleeing husbands, and children fleeing fathers and mothers, all right, runaways. As the system developed in America, all these kind of people going to America, right, they're telling you, as indentured servants. Other forms and styles of servitude sprang up. Illegitimate children and the children of the poor were routinely bound out until they were 21 years old. Colonial adults were also bound out to pay debts or to satisfy legal requirements. This system did not spring full-blown from the heads of the original settlers. It evolved piece by piece, act by act, within the context of the colonial syndrome. In the beginning, the system was based on voluntary contract, which carried with it no implication of servility, but as Laga has shown, the system deteriorated and tended to pass into a property relation which asserted a control of varying extent over the bodies and liberties of their person during service as if they were things. The fundamental difference between the servant and the slave was the length of service. Servitude was not a hereditary status. The servant also had limited rights of appeal. The system of white servitude evolved in America, but it evolved within a context of experience which came to America with the first white immigrants. In fact, a large proportion of the first English immigrants were bound to service or labor for an unspecified number of years. Again, a large proportion of the first English immigrants, we're talking about English who are pale skin and English who are colored, were bound to service or labor for an unspecified number of years. Most of the pioneer Virginia settlers, for example, were de facto slaves of the Virginia Company. You hear that? The pioneering Virginia settlers were what? De facto slaves of the Virginia Company. All right, these aristocrats that eventually became aristocrats, they came in, a lot of them, as slaves or indentured servants, which banned private property and ruled by martial law. Molina and other inhabitants of this proto-fascist state complained that they were being treated like slaves. According to surviving documents, the first white settlers in Virginia were driven to work in gangs and punished severely for minor infractions. Anyone who missed church on Sunday was to lie neck and heels that night and be a slave for a week. For the third offense, the colonist was to be a slave for a year and a day. Things were not much better further north, where the Puritans began their crusade for democracy by reducing to servitude a relatively large number of white men. All right, you hearing all this? It was in 1628, 8 years before the first evidence of red bondage in Massachusetts, and 10 years before the first hint of black bondage, that white bondage began in the Puritan Commonwealth. In that year, 180 servants landed at Salem to prepare the food and homes for the pioneers of the history books who came over a year later. You heard that? In addition to men and women held to service or labor, several white pioneers were condemned to slavery within a few years after the first landing. In 1609, Henry Spelman, a Virginia colonist, was apparently sold to the Indians by Captain John Smith. Spelman, who was rescued a year later, said, "I was carried by Captain Smith, our president, to G. Felice, to G. Little Powhatan." All right, who? Captain John Smith, president, right? President, right? They called him a president, right? Future video. There was a lot of presidents before George Washington. All right. So again, our president, to G. Felice, to G. Little Powhatan, were unknown to me. He sold me to him for a town called Powhatan. This was apparently a fairly common occurrence in the early days, for we are also told that in 1609 Admiral Newport gave Powhatan a boy named Thomas Salvage in exchange for an Indian servant. A few years later, the colony of Massachusetts was openly sentencing white men to slavery for penal offenses. In 1641, for example, William Andrews was condemned to slavery by the General Court for assaulting his master. John Hazelwood and Giles Player were also sentenced to slavery for theft and housebreaking. By 1642, at least 6 white men had been condemned to slavery in Massachusetts for various offenses. Some were apparently released before their deaths. There was also an interesting case of white slavery in Connecticut. According to Bernard C. Steiner, History of Slavery in Connecticut, a white man was sold into slavery in Barbados because of notorious stealing, breaking up and robbing 2 mills and living in a renegade manner in the wilderness. It is probable that there were scattered cases of white slavery in both the North and the South throughout the colonial period. Although some Indians were reduced to slavery and servitude in the first decade of the 17th century, the colonial masters continued to rely on the poor whites of Europe. Again, even though they were enslaving Indians, right? They were still heavily relying still in the 17th century on European. They saying whites, but they mean Europeans. They were calling these people Christians. Remember that the word white didn't exist there for 60 years. These are also dark-skinned Europeans. I want you to make sure you understand that. From the very beginning, poor white children were picked up on the streets and in the almshouses of London and Bristol and Amsterdam and shipped to the colonies. There were also irregular shipments of maids, some of uncertain character, and laborers. It was not until 1619 that the colonial rulers began to shape this irregular traffic into an organized system. All right, until 1619 is when they got organized, right? When did the first so-called 20-odd Negroes come? 1619, right? Ironically enough, the first step on this road was taken at the first meeting of a representative political body in white America. At its first meeting in Jamestown, the Virginia legislature provided for the recording and enforcing of contracts of indenture, forbade servants from marrying without consent, and authorized masters to whip their servants. These acts legalized indenture in Virginia and provided for a statutory class of unfree laborers. Thus, representative democracy and servitude, white servitude, were born together in America. Again, thus representative democracy and servitude. You see, democracy was the first Democrats, white supremacists. When towards the end of this interesting year, the first blacks landed at Jamestown, the first black so-called blacks, right? Dodge the hijack. They found the system of servitude firmly established and most of the white population living in the shadow of chains. First so-called blacks were also actually indentured servants. We know that, right? In that same year, a ship from London brought 100 white women and they were bought up immediately at a price of 120 pounds of tobacco each. Another memorable event of the year was the arrival of 100 poor children from the streets of England. 8 years later, about 1,500 kidnapped children were sent to Virginia. So I know we're reading this article from the Ebony magazine from 1969, November, but we've already verified a lot of these facts. that he's stating. We've already verified most of this information on parts 1, 2, and 3 and my other videos. So again, 1,500 kidnapped children were sent to Virginia. European children. This include colored and pale skin, light complexion, white, as you call white people. And their services were so satisfactory that the authorities pleaded for another shipment of the friendless boys and girls. The number of servants crossing the Atlantic increased year by year, and by the middle of the century, the trade in white men was an international business which commanded the attention of politicians, merchants, captains, and bankers. All right, this was business. They're gonna keep saying white, Europeans, white, but there's also colored people in there too. All right, but now, this whole time, where's the Africans? If the numbers of servants crossing the Atlantic increased year by year, where it became an international business, and you had politicians and bankers and all these people, captains involved. The servants came from all over Christian Europe, from Germany and from Holland and Sweden and Scotland. Most, however, came from England and Ireland. They came, these Christian demi-slaves, the same way most black slaves came, the same way so-called colored people came in. That's what I'm trying to tell you. The same way, crammed shoulder to shoulder, toe to toe, the living and dead side by side in the unventilated holds of crowded ships. All right? In this respect and others, there were striking similarities. Just like we read in the last video, packed like sardines, like fish, like herring. In this respect and others, there were striking similarities between the white slave trade and the black slave trade. There is no difference. It was all indentured servants. In fact, many of the same ports and the same merchants were involved in both trades. All right, same what? Same ports, same merchants. It was all the same. They're trying to separate it in history, but it wasn't like that. Some of the big African slave traders acquired their experience and capital in the white servant trade. You hear what they're saying, right? So it started with white servant trade. What African slave trade? Show me one ship. Dodge the hijack. There were also common mechanisms in the systems of capture and delivery. It was not for nothing that the trade in Irish servants was called the Irish slave trade. The trade in men, whether white men or black men or red men, was big business. Again, the trade in men, humans, men, whether they were what? Caucasian or white, pale skin, or what? So-called black, colored, melanated men, or red men, what you call red, ruddy, whatever you want to call red men, was big business. It was big business. It didn't matter the complexion. It was big business. And the men who profited from that business used the accepted merchandising and marketing skills. Most of the big traders and captains relied on hired agents who scoured the countryside, distributing propaganda, leaflets, and trumpeting the virtues of life as a bonded servant in Virginia or Maryland or Pennsylvania. We got that before, right? How they were recruiting people to send them over here, promising, like, hey man, it's gonna be great. After 7 years, you're gonna get this and that. It's just a little bit of work. But it was, a lot of them went through hell just to get, that piece of land or whatever they got after, their freedom dues. But when these methods failed, other forms of persuasion were used, including kidnapping and coercion. Remember, they were spiriting them away, spirits, right? Kidnapping, usually with the explicit or implicit cooperation of the authorities. Ruthless agents called spirits, there you go, openly kidnapped men, women, and children on the streets of Bristol and other cities and held them in depots until the day of departure. These spirits were good at their trade, these spirits. One man said he had spirited away 500 persons a year for 12 years. He was making money. In 1617, an affidavit was sworn out against one William Thien, who spirited away 840 persons in a single year. You hear that? Kidnapped. As can be imagined, this was not a particularly good period for people who liked to walk the streets alone. In fact, things got so bad in London that one could precipitate a major riot by shouting the word spirit. There were other stratagems equally successful. Some ship captains made a practice of visiting the Clerkenwell House of Correction and plying the women prisoners with drinks. When the women were sufficiently drunk, the captains, with the connivance of the warden, would carry them up to America. You hear this? Captains and magistrates also recruited prostitutes. On November 17, 1692, one Narcissus Luttrell noted in his diary that a ship lay in Leith going for Virginia, on board which the magistrates had ordered 50 lewd women out of the houses of correction and 30 others who walked the streets after 10 at night. From time to time, the colonial authorities scheduled special projects. For example, there was the famous and controversial project for sending some 1,000 young Irish girls to Jamaica for breeding purposes. Again, this is deep. From time to time, the colonial authorities scheduled special projects. For example, there was the famous and controversial project for sending some 1,000 young Irish girls to Jamaica for breeding purposes. So where's their offspring today? Wouldn't it be more lighter, more pale skin in Jamaica? Because a lot of these Irish were so-called black Irish they were sending over there. For what breeding purposes? 1,000 young Irish girls for breeding purposes to Jamaica? No one seems to know what happened to this plan, but there is a letter of one Henry Cromwell which throws a curious light on the age concerning the young women. Although we must use force and taking them up, yet it being so much for their own good and likely to be of so great advantage to the public, it is not in the least doubted that you may have such number of them as you shall think fit to make use upon this account. Another source of unwilling colonists was the penitentiary. The best estimates suggest that at least 50,000 convicts were shipped to America in this period, and that most of them went to Virginia and Maryland, which were known in some circles as penal colonies. Again, penal colonies. This is real history here that's in this Ebony magazine from 1969. The dude did his research. The person who wrote this did his research. And in his world in 1969, everything European was white. But we know that not everything European was white. There was people of color there still. As Benjamin Franklin told us in the 1700s still. Right? We're talking about the same time period here. And they were sending 50,000 convicts. They went mostly to Virginia and Maryland, and these were known as penal colonies. Penal colonies. They were dumping all these criminals over here on your ancestors' land and taking them. And these people, what do you think they were going to do? These were criminals, convicts. Marcus W. Jernigan, author of Labor and Independent Classes in Colonial America, has written, in this connection it has been suggested that American genealogists in search of missing data to complete their family tree would find a rich mine of unexplored material in the archives of the prisons of Newgate and Old Bailey, the latter filling 110 manuscript volumes. Some of the convicts, incidentally, were openly identified as slaves, bound for life. Bound, indentured servant for life. These convicts, they didn't care because they were convicts, so they were just putting these life-term indentures on them. Political prisoners. 2. Defeated soldiers, Irish priests, Quaker, and other dissenters completed the cast of characters for the white servant trade drama. The political prisoners served for varying lengths of time. Again, so they're letting you know that Quakers were also indentured servants and served as political prisoners or convicts, right? Quakers too. So if Abraham Lincoln's saying, hey, my great-grandfather, hey, all my family's Quakers, well, might have been indentured servants. We already know that his dad was, and he was one. His mom seemed to have been treated as one as well. Passed around her family like an apprentice. All right, so look at this. Quakers came in here as indentured servants, and they were serving these life sentences, these indentures for life, because they were political prisoners. All right? The political prisoners served for varying lengths of time, but some were slaves condemned in the language of the day to serve in our colonies in America during the term of their natural lives. During the term of their natural lives. Slaves for lives, Europeans, both black and so-called white and so-called black. Didn't matter the complexion of these Europeans. It should be said that white authorities who are very defensive on this point say they cannot find evidence that the prisoners actually served life sentences. It should also be said that the failure to find evidence is not by any means evidence. This is from the Johns Hopkins University Studies in Historical and Political Science by Herbert B. Adams. He's the editor. It says History and Past Politics and Politics of Present History. Freeman. 14th series. Says the 4th and the 5th, Slavery and Servitude in the Colony of North Carolina by John Spencer Bassett, PhD, Professor of History and Political Science in Trinity College, North Carolina. And this is back from 1896 by the John Hopkins Press, all right, 1896. And I'm on page 75. This is chapter 5, White Servitude. And it says here, the first slaves that we hear of in North Carolina were white people. All right, again, the first slaves that we hear of in North Carolina were white people, and their masters were what? Indians, so-called negro, right? Indians. Who's the real Indian? Well, we're talking about copper-colored tribes of America, right? Copper-colored people had Europeans as slaves or servants, right? Strachey in his travels into Virginia speak of a story that he had from the Indians of an Indian chief, a Yanoco, who lived at Ritano, somewhere in the region to the south of Virginia, and who had 7 whites who escaped out of the massacre at Roanoke, and these he used to beat copper. It is not improbable that there is a shadow of truth in the statement, although the details must be fictitious, that the Indians of the colony later on did enslave the whites whom they could take in their waters or who were shipwrecked off the coast. We know from the preamble of an act of the Assembly about 1707. This form of white servitude left no trace in the life of the colony. The first laborers that in the English took to the New World colonies were whites, who during the first years of their residence were obliged to serve the settlers in the capacity of bonded servants. These people were commonly called servants or Christian servants. Remember, we got this in the past parts. They were just labeling themselves Christians. They weren't really calling themselves white. Remember, that didn't exist for about 60 years after 1619. It didn't exist in any record. It started way after classifying people as white. And remember, we got to be careful with that. And we know that a lot of these Europeans were not just pale skin white. All right, they were people of color too, and as such are to be distinguished from slaves. In regard to them, as well as to the slaves, their history as it related to North Carolina begins in Virginia. There were 3 sources of the supply of these servants. There were indentured servants, people of no means, who being unable to pay for passage to America, agreed to assign themselves for a certain period to some ship captain on condition that when he reached Virginia, he might transfer his rights for money to someone who would maintain and work the servant for the given period. Transported felons, who were such criminals, vagabonds, or other obnoxious persons, were sent to the colonies by order of the English courts. All right, that was the most of them. That was the large part of them. Kidnapped persons, and here's another large portion of these indentured servants. Kidnapped persons, usually children, who were stolen by traders or ship captains in the London or Liverpool streets and taken to America, where they were assigned till of age to such planters as would pay the prices demanded for their passages. From these 3 sources, many people came to Virginia during the first 60 years of its settlement. Again, during the first 60 years, there was no record of anybody calling anybody white. So whoever wrote this, talking about the first people who were enslaved, the first laborers were whites, and he's talking about the first 60 years. We already got in law books, statute books, we've shown that they didn't have that anywhere until 60 years later, after 1619, after they started establishing their colonies and bringing in these indentured servants by the large numbers. Continuing the book, it says, in the early period of North Carolina, there was continual complaint that people harbored runaway servants, all right, runaway servants. Governor Nicholson made the charge in 1691, and Edward Randolph, Surveyor General, repeated the charge in 1696. The situation of North Carolina was favorable to Virginia runaways, and it is likely that when servants left their masters in that province, they took refuge in the swamps and the forests to the southward. Who? Servants, not African slaves. But there is nothing to show that North Carolina encouraged such runaways. Henderson Walker wrote in 1699 that the law for apprehending runaway Negroes was adequate. He must have referred to the law we find on the statute book in 1715. By that law, we learn that any Christian servant who ran away from his master should, on being captured, be compelled to serve above his regular period of servitude, double the time he was away, and in addition such longer time as the court should deem sufficient to repay the master for whatever damage he may have sustained. This provision was incorporated in the law of 1741. As many servants ran away in North Carolina itself as in Virginia, it seems John Ormstone, who seems here to have had nothing to gain by an exaggeration, said in 1716, white servants are seldom worth the keeping and never stay out of the time indented for. All right, in another book from the Johns Hopkins University Studies in Historical and Political Science, and this is White Servitude in Maryland, 1634 to 1820 by Eugene Irvin McCormick, PhD, instructor in American History, University of California, and this is from 1904. All right, White Servitude in Maryland. It says here, the system of servitude, thus early established in Virginia, was adopted by Lord Baltimore as a means of settling and developing the colony of Maryland. All right, now, real quick, now, a lot of the Moors like to, when they see like Baltimore, so is this person a Moor? His last name is Baltimore. Is this Lord Baltimore who was establishing the colony of Maryland and proposing to bring indentured servants? Is he a Moor? I'm just saying because, I'm not saying he is. I'm just saying based on what you guys always say, so I'd have to look into that. Too poor to send out settlers himself, he induced others to transport servants in return for grants of land and the new colony. All right, so he was trying to make people to finance, the transportation of these servants he wanted to colonize Maryland with. All right, this Lord Baltimore. All right. Many who did not wish to go in person furnished Baltimore money for transporting servants and received their pay in lands. The servants usually signed a written contract called an indenture, which bound them to serve a master for a specified number of years and return for free transportation, food, clothing, and 50 acres of land. Remember the headright system. From this contract, whether they signed it or not, all servants came to be called indentured servants, whether they signed it or not. Remember, by force they were bringing people over here. Concerning the motives which led Lord Baltimore to found the colony of Maryland, there have been much dispute among writers on toleration. By confining their attention to this religious controversy, they have apparently lost sight of the underlying principle in Baltimore's plans, which overshadowed all others, that of revenue. All right, it was a business. He wanted revenue. There is very little evidence to support the theory that Maryland was founded as a home for persecuted Catholics. All right, that's the story they told everybody. A majority of the first settlers sent out were Protestants. All right, Protestants. Who was known Protestants? Talking about Huguenots, the French Huguenots. Does that include Huguenots in these Protestants? We'll dig into that, right? All right, just want to read something real quick here in chapter 3. It says, number and economic importance says the actual number of servants imported into Maryland and the ratio which they bore to the free inhabitants cannot easily be determined from the scanty records which have been left us. All historians of Maryland complain of the dearth of contemporaneous material. Outside of purely legal documents, the settlers have left us very few journals or records of historical value. All right, so now they're letting you know that here in Maryland, they don't really know how many indentured servants there really was, or coming in or anything, or if there was more indentured servants than slaves or more European indentured servants than so-called Negroes in indenture. You understand? So whatever numbers they ever gave you in history, it was all a lie. If they ever said, no, it was very few indentured servants here, it was more so-called Negroes here as slaves, Well, that's a lie because they don't have any records. They're making things up. Or I just wanted to verify that here. They're letting you know here. Then it says, for some time after the founding of the colony, talking about Maryland, right? The servants came exclusively from Great Britain, Ireland, and Virginia. All right, not Africa, any of these servants. Of the original immigrants, the ratio of servants to freemen was probably about 6 to 1. All right, more servants than free men. In the Assembly of 1637, which all freemen were required to attend, only 90 appeared either in person or by proxy, leaving about 220 who must have been servants. This would make the ratio at this time 7 to 3. The increase in this proportion of freemen was due to the expiration of some of the servants' terms and to the immigration from Virginia. So freemen also included, if there was a white indentured European and he did his time in 7 years and it was over, then he became a freeman too. As nearly all indentures were negotiable, they were regularly disposed of at auction or private sale. The following is an example of the notices which appeared in the papers whenever a servant ship arrived in port. It says here, just arrived in the ship Sophia, Alexander Berdine, master from Dublin, 20 stout, healthy, indented men servants with 20 people, it says, whose indentures will be disposed of on reasonable terms by the captain on board or the subscriber, etc. The price received for servants varied according to their skill, age, and other personal qualities, but the average price for adults seems to have been about 15 to 20 pounds, all right? People from Europe being sold, right? Like property, people being sold. Governor Sharp, in a letter to Baltimore in 1755, states that convicts were regularly sold by the contractors at 8 to 20 pounds each. Besides the ordinary indentured servants, there were many apprentices in Maryland throughout the colonial period. These were minors and were bound out by their parents, guardians, or by courts. They were subject to many of the same restrictions as other servants, but also enjoyed many privileges peculiar to apprentices. And we're continuing the book, White Servitude in Maryland, 1634 to 1820, by Eugene Irvin McCormick from the Johns Hopkins University Historical Political Science, reviews. And it says chapter 5, it says fugitive servants. One of the most noticeable features of indentured servitude, and one which greatly impeded the successful operation of the institution, was the large number of runaways. All right, all these runaways, you thought it was just African slaves. No, it was indentured servants, large number of them, from the founding of the colony to the dying out of white servitude. From the very beginning, in the first half of the 19th century, there's abundant evidence that large numbers of servants deserted the service of their masters, and their apprehension was one of the most serious problems with which the planters had to deal. These slave catchers, who were they going after really? Indentured servants. When we consider the class of persons who made up the servant body and the conditions under which they were very often entered into servitude, we need not be surprised at the great number of fugitives. But on the contrary, we find ourselves wondering why there were not more. This desertion from service was due to several causes, and the blame attaches sometimes to the servant, sometimes to the master or the speculator, and very often to neither, but to the inherent evils of the institution itself. Often the servant, when captured, gave as his reasons for running away that his master did not provide sufficient food and clothing or had treated him cruelly. Investigation sometimes proved this to be the case. At other times it was found to be only an excuse. Another class of servants ran away as soon as they discovered the deception that had been practiced upon them by the contractors who had induced them to come to America. They had been led to believe by accounts published in such tracts as Alsop's Character of the Province of Maryland, and from the stories of wealth, ease, and luxury told them by agents whose business it was to drum up recruits for transportation, that the life of a servant was an easy one, and that it was a stepping stone to fame and fortune. So this is the thing they were selling. Remember, they were going around with brochures over there. If you remember the past videos, we were talking about this a lot. They were going out there recruiting people, by the thousands. The American dream. It says these agents or crimps, writes Edis, who had often seen their advertisements in London, represent the advantages to be obtained in America, in colors so alluring that it is almost impossible to resist their artifices. Many of these immigrants had no intention of binding themselves to servitude, but were led by the agents to believe that laborers were so eagerly sought after and wages so high that they might, by hiring for a short time, to some planter, pay back the passage money, and go free. Outside of the convict class, by far the largest number of runaway came from the ranks of the outcast and ne'er-do-wells from the cities of England and Ireland. All right, these outcasts, many of them fleeing from justice or suffering from the pangs of hunger, were attracted by the glowing accounts given by the agents and eagerly accepted this method of reaching the land of gold. They were induced, they were forced, they were kind of like schemed into coming over here and putting themselves in an indenture. It is not at all likely that these persons had any intention of fulfilling the conditions of the indenture and thought only of the free transportation to America. So a lot of these dudes are like, yeah, but when I get over there, the first thing I'm doing I'm running away, I'm escaping. I ain't working for 7 years. These and the convicts became the professional runaways. All right, the convicts and all these outcasts, these were the runaways, not no African slaves. You understand what we're reading here? Like, this is in Maryland, but this happened in a mass scale all over all these states where they had indentured servants. These same type of indentured servants, too, convicts and these outcasted people from Europe. From the publication of the first newspaper in Maryland till long after the Revolution, it is difficult to find a number whose columns do not contain from 1 to 10 advertisements for runaway servants. All right, we've seen a lot of examples of that already, right? All these newspapers during those times filled with runaway ads of servants, and a lot of them being described as what? Swarthy or dark complexioned, and they're like Irish, Scot, English, all this stuff, right? And it is apparent from the description given that they usually belong to this class. I have counted as many as 16 of these notices in a single issue of the Maryland Gazette from August 9, 1753. Go look it up. These advertisements for runaways throw much light upon various phases of servitude. Speedy apprehension depended to a great degree on an accuracy of description of the person, his mannerisms, his clothing, his nationality, and other details which can be found in no other. So these advertisements show that by far the greatest number of fugitives were Irish, and next in order came the English. Now remember, when they're talking about all these Irish people, before these so-called Irish were being sent over to Americas, to the colonies in the West Indies and the colonies in North America or South America, basically there was a lot of other Europeans that were being outcasted in their own countries or their own homelands or wherever they were settled and being basically put in Ireland too. All these outcasts from Germany, from France, Scotland, England, they were sending them to Ireland. And then from there, they would send them over here. So a lot of them came in as Irish, but they might have been from other countries, is what I'm trying to say. Again, we continue in the book White Servitude in Maryland from 1634 to 1820. And then we're in chapter 7. It says here, servant militia. It says in Maryland, as in other colonies, servants were required to perform military duty and defending themselves and others from the attacks of the Indians, who European indentured servants, both pale and colored Europeans. It was always a much disputed question whether the government had the right to impair the contract between master and servant by impressing the latter into the army. In the early years of the colony, no provisions was made by the assembly for supplying the army with food and munitions of war, and the expenses of a campaign were borne by the individual planters. And we'll continue in the book White Servitude in Maryland, 1634 to 1820 by Eugene Irvin McCormick. We're in chapter 8 now, and they're talking about the convicts, and it says here, from the reign of James I, of King James, till the separation of the colonies from England, large numbers of convicts were annually transported to the 13 colonies, as well as the Barbados, Jamaica, and other islands, and influenced materially the history of both the mother country and the plantations, these indentured servants, not Africans, to the West Indies, Jamaica, Barbados, and the other islands, not Africans, indentured servants. The English kings, ever solicitous about the want of laborers in America, kindly consented to send over all their unmanageable subjects to become servants in the plantations, a kindness not always appreciated by the colonists. Convicts were sent to Virginia and Barbados before the founding of Maryland, but after the settlement of the latter colony and continually throughout the colonial period, she received her share. All right, Maryland got a lot of convicts too, and in fact, a greater number than any other province. Mad convicts, a lot of the most convicts. Maryland was full of what? Convicts. The most were sent to Maryland. Called Kurimeo, who made a special study of crimes and criminals in England, and speaking of transportation after 1718 says, the system continued for 56 years, during which period and until the commencement of the American War in 1775, great numbers of felons were sent chiefly to the province of Maryland. All right, all these felons. Available material furnishes no clue to the actual number of convicts sent to Maryland before the Revolution. Strauss has estimated the number at least 20,000, and the annual importation between the years 1750 and 1770 at 400 to 500. So they don't know. Remember, they have no clue. They don't know. They're making this up. They're being modest, and they're putting these in quotations. Remember, when they don't know something, they'll do this. They'll put their quotations on it, right? Because they don't really know. So judging from the newspaper records of the arrival of convicts at Annapolis and Baltimore, this estimate is not too high, if indeed it is high enough. Other estimates have been made of the whole number of involuntary emigrants sent from the British Isles to the American plantations. Between 1717 and 1775, the number sent from the Old Bailey alone is thought to be at least 10,000, and the whole number from various places in Great Britain and Ireland at least 50,000. Says here the greatest number of the 7-year passengers, that's what they call them because they were indentured for 7 years, sent to the plantations were ordinary criminals from various jails of Great Britain and Ireland. Among them were men and women of all ages and descriptions. They represented all crimes, if some of the offenses may be so classed, some stealing a loaf of bread to sustain life, to highway robbery, all right, from petty crimes to, big crimes, and a lot of them wasn't even their fault. They were just hungry. The worst criminals were seldom transported, but were executed in large numbers after every session of the court. The number was augmented at various times by the transportation of rebel convicts. Most of these were sent to the Barbados and other islands. They sent them to Barbados, right, so they couldn't escape. So a lot of these, when they say rebel convicts, what are they talking about? Like Jacobites, Quakers, Protestants, or what are they talking about? What kind of rebels? Most of these were sent to the Barbados and other islands, but during the 18th century, some were sent to New England, Virginia, and Maryland. In the summer of 1717, 135 Scotch rebels were sent to Maryland and sold as servants. All right? It is difficult to tell from the court records and state papers where the great number were sent, as there is seldom any more specific destination given than the plantations or the West Indies. All right, again, where? Plantations working in the fields, cotton fields, but tobacco fields, sugarcane fields. Yes, not Africans. These are indentured servants from where? Europe. And what did they have here? They had local labor as well. Your ancestors, the aboriginals that were already here, so-called Negroes, what they would say. Right, working with these indentured servants. That was you over here. In the calendar of state papers for December 13, 1666, there is an interesting entry concerning the disposition of Scotch rebels. The resolution about the Scotch rebels is to hang all ministers and officers of the common sort. 1 in 10 is to be executed, 1 forced to confession, and the rest sent to plantations. The rebels sent to the West Indies in the 17th century were required to serve 10 years. In a letter of the king to the governor of Jamaica, he instructs the governor that all the late rebels sent to Jamaica, who's these rebels? Are these Jacobites? Who's these rebels being sent? All right, who are these people? Are these royal black nobles being sent to Jamaica and the West Indies Islands? It says, shall serve their masters 10 years without permission to redeem themselves by money or otherwise till that term be expired. The governor is ordered to propose a bill to the council and assembly for enforcing the order. The term of service for the Monmouth rebels, right, there we go, sent to Barbados was also 10 years, while ordinary servants were bound for only 4 years. It says the following are examples of many notices found in the magazines. All right, so this is an example of what they were saying in those times. It says 430 rebel prisoners from the gaols of Carlisle, Lancaster, Chester, York, and Lincoln from England, right, were transported this month from Liverpool for the plantations. All right, who? English people or English indentured servants to the plantations. 8 of them were drowned by boat over setting, not being able to swim because they were handcuffed. So 8 of these prisoners or rebels drowned because they had them handcuffed and their little boat overturned. You see that? That's cruelty. This number with the rest makes about 1,000 transported. 105 felons, convict taken out of Newgate, the Marshalsea, and several other county gauls were put on shipboard to be transported to Maryland. Felons transported from Newgate, May 17, 1736, 4 for life, 3 for 14 years, and 100 for 7 years. You hear that? 4 were going to work for life. 4 were going for life, for life. Chattel property. You were what? An indentured servant for life. 4 of them already had that before going over there. These are Europeans, not Africans, and 100 of them for 7 years. The Maryland Gazette records the arrival of many convict vessels all through the 18th century. Loads of 50 to 100 or more were regularly landed at the ports of Baltimore and Annapolis, especially the latter city. The editors of the day frequently indulge in jokes at the expense of this class of immigrants. For example, the Maryland Gazette gives the following account of the arrival of a convict ship at Annapolis. And it says here, Friday, last arrived here from London after a passage of 29 days. All right, after a what? A middle passage. After a middle passage, right? They crossed the Atlantic, right? Oh, this one doesn't count? Oh, and this is not considered a slave ship? All right, so 29 days at sea, middle passage, Captain James Dobbins in the Thames frigate with 130 of His Majesty's passengers who were of the home, so expert in knowing in some arts that they were obliged to travel for the better peopling of His Majesty's American plantations, at least for the term of 7 years. All right, because of their arts, they were making fun of them. But the newspapers do not give a complete record of the arrival of these vessels in Maryland. The advertisements for runaway convicts often state that they came at particular time and in a particular ship, no account of which is given in the papers. Large, therefore, as the recorded numbers appear, the actual number was much greater. So even though we have some records of numbers, it was much greater. It was way more than they're telling us. Way more numbers of indentured servants over so-called African slaves. And we continue in the book, White Servitude in Maryland, 1634 to 1820, and they get to the conclusion. They're saying that importation of servants into Maryland from Great Britain and Ireland seems to have reached its height about the middle of the 18th century, talking about the 1700s. From the time down to the Revolution, the number of voluntary servants brought into the colony gradually diminished. Convicts, on the other hand, came in ever increasing numbers. So convicts were one of the major sources of Maryland servants. And during the 20 years which preceded the Revolution, Maryland received nearly all that were transported. After the Revolution, Maryland was getting all the felons, all the convicts. As slavery was firmly rooted in Virginia, there was little demand for convict labor, and laws were enacted to exclude them. In Pennsylvania, the German immigrants more than supplied the demand for servants. All right, we got that already, all the German indentured servants that were there. All right. And the convict element there was insignificant. But in Maryland, the contractors always found a ready market for His Majesty's passengers, in spite of their sentiment against them. The Ebony magazine from 1969, the survivors of the first stage of the process of selection were assembled at ports and packed like fish into the holds of ships for the 8 to 12 week trip to America. Packed like fish. We got this in the last video, the last part of this series. Part 3, from a very primary source. All this research in this magazine in Ebony 1969 is, you can research this. Under the best circumstances, this trip was a harrowing experience. Under the conditions imposed on the servants, it was almost unsupportable. There was little or no room for movement between the decks. All right. We're not talking about Kunta Kinte here. We're talking about European indentured servants packed like fish on ships. The food was poor and mortality was high. Sometimes more than half of the servants died before the ship reached America. Again, we got this in the last videos. All right, more correlation here. Henry Lawrence, the South Carolinian who bought and sold white and black flesh said he never saw an instance of cruelty in 10 or 12 years experience in that branch. The African slave trade equal to the cruelty exercised upon these poor Irish. All right, so I would like to see the original source and see if he's really saying African or Negro, colored, equal to the cruelty or Aboriginal American island. Self-interest prompted the baptized heathens, captains, to take some care of their wretched slaves for a market, but no other care was taken of those poor Protestant Christians from Ireland, but to deliver as many as possible alive on shore upon the cheapest terms. All right, Protestant Christians, Protestants. We know the French Huguenots were Protestants. We know a lot of these French Huguenots, a lot of these people from different religions and different countries were ending up in Ireland. They were being dumped there first for a couple years, and then from there they were sending them over here. So a lot of these Protestants might be French Huguenots. Remember that, because I'm doing a whole special on the Huguenots. When the ships arrived in American ports, the dead were thrown overboard and the survivors were spruced up for on-deck sales. In some cases, both men and women were stripped naked and examined by the prospective buyers. Abbot Emerson Smith wrote, the servants were produced from their quarters. The prospective purchasers walked them up and down, felt on their muscles, judged their states of health and morality, conversed with them to discover their degrees of intelligence and docility, and finally, if satisfied, bought them and carried them off home. The whole scene bore resemblance to a cattle market. A number of servants afterwards compared themselves to horses displayed for sale. All right? So I know a lot of people are questioning this. No, it can't be the same as Africa. No. Kurimeo, but this house, don't try to, nobody's trying to, say who suffered more. What I'm trying to let you know is that whatever this person is writing here is history. It happened. It happened to European indentured servants. That whole Kunta Kinte story only happening to African slaves? No, that didn't just happen. Where do you think they got those stories from? They got it from real history happening to real people. In this case, happening to a lot of the Europeans as indentured servants that were coming over here. That's who they were bringing over here, and then they were enslaving the local population, the so-called Negro, the Indian American Indians over here, the Aborigines, indigenous people together. We're not talking about Africans here. Continue said, and after they checked them and all that, right, says, and finally, if satisfied, they bought them and carried them off home. The whole scene bore resemblance to a cattle market. A number of servants afterwards compared themselves to horses displayed for the sale. The prices varied with time and place. In the 17th century, one could buy a good white man or white woman for from 15 to 20 pounds. In the bargaining, servants who did not speak English were systematically victimized. Most servants, incidentally, could not read or write. Among the leading buyers and sellers of servants were the most distinguished men in the colonies. Some like William Carter, Robert Beverly of Virginia, had a hand in the Indian, white, and black trades. Carter, for example, bought and sold blacks and whites and engaged in the Indian fur trade. Among the well-known Americans who bought white servants was George Washington. Again, we got a whole video. I did a whole video on this, right? That George Washington's, his plantation was all indentured servants. He didn't have no Africans. It was all indentured servants, most of them Europeans. And it says here again, among the well-known Americans who bought white servants was George Washington. We're going to let you know who George Washington's ancestors are. What does have to do with Huguenots? During the sale, husbands and wives were separated, and children under 5 were sold or given away until their 21st birthday. G. Middleburger, who came to America in 1750, said, many parents must sell and trade away their children like so many head of cattle. All right, so we got told this whole story that African people were coming over here, families separated, only Negro this and Africans this and Negroes this, but this was happening to indentured servants. Some enterprising and incentive merchants called soul drivers bought servants in lots of 50 or more and drove them through the country, selling them by ones and twos to local planners. You hear all this? White servants were also sold individually on auction blocks. In some cases, whites, blacks, and reds were sold from the same stand. Again, it wasn't about complexion. The consummation of the sale changed the servant's relationship with himself and with his fellow men, for he now became subject to the will, interest, and whim of another human being. In theory, as we have seen, he had the right of appeal to a court of masters. In practice, as almost every student of white servitude has pointed out, he was a de facto slave until the end of his indenture. J.B. McMaster wrote, "They became in the eyes of the law a slave, and in both the civil and the criminal code were classed with the Negro and the Indian." Same, again, classed with what? With the Negro and Indian, white, pale-skinned people, European indentures. They were worked hard, were dressed in the cast-off clothes of their owners, and might be flogged as often as the master and mistress thought necessary. Father, mother, and children could be sold to different buyers. John Fiske said their lives were in theory protected by law, but where an indented servant came to his death from prolonged ill usage or from excessive punishment or even from sudden violence, it was not easy to get a verdict against the master. In those days of frequent flogging, the lash was inflicted upon the indented servant with scarcely less compunction than upon the purchased slave, and in general the condition of the former seems to have been nearly as miserable as that of the latter. Remember, it's the same system. They're trying to say, African slaves here, but it's basically extended indentured servitude was basically being done to the so-called Negro more eventually. And that's what they're saying, what replaced. Continues, says, save that the servitude of the Negro was perpetual, all right? That's what I just said. Eventually, the Negro was getting the life term of the indenture more, while that of the white man was pretty sure to come to an end. Pretty sure that because he was white and they were creating this whole white, the invention of the white race, right? As we read in the last video, they were most likely going to get their freedom dues after their contract was over, and as somebody of color was most likely not. They were changing laws to make that happen. For him, Pandora's box had not quite spilled out the last of its contents. If we judge by contemporary reports, almost all the contents of Pandora's box engulfed the hapless white servant. The record bulges with cases of appalling cruelty, and many observers said that the lot of the white servant was worse than that of the black slave. In a letter written in 1770, Edis said, Negroes being a property for life, the death of slaves in the prime of youth and strength in a material loss to the proprietor. They are therefore under more comfortable circumstances than the miserable Europeans, over whom the rigid planners exercise an inflexible severity. Generally speaking, they, white servants, groan beneath a worse than Egyptian bondage. You hear all this, they're trying to compare European indentured servitude, not white or black bondage. They're talking about European indentured servitude compared to what we thought slavery was. But slavery, like how we think Junta Quinta and all that, that didn't exist like that. It was basically, again, indentured servitude. These indentures were being extended for life, eventually more to the so-called Negro. But these so-called, white Europeans, or these just Europeans, were going through the same bondage. All right, the same kind of reports came from Barbados, where Richard Ligon said he saw such cruelty done to servants as I did not think one Christian could have done to another. In Barbados and on the mainland, servant women were systematically exploited by masters and overseers. Many of this class of women, Philip A. Bruce said, were exposed to improper advances on their master's part, as they were, by their situation, very much in the power of these masters, who, if inclined to licentiousness, would not be slow to use it. In the corn and tobacco fields and in the barns, the female agricultural servants of English birth were also thrown into a very close and promiscuous association with the lowest class of men to be found in the colony. And the opportunities thus constantly arising, no doubt, led to frequent immoralities, and the same was true of the social intercourse after hours of labor, for the day were over, and also during the various holidays, including Sundays, which the servants and slaves enjoyed. The laws defining the servants' rights and obligations varied from state to state, but there was a common core. As a rule, servants could not marry without consent, and they could not buy whiskey or engage in trade. They could not leave the plantation area without a pass or raise their hand against the master, nor could they vote or hold office. Like the slave, the servant could be bought, sold, borrowed, won, or lost in a card game, given away as a prize, seized for a debt, pledged as a security on a loan, or transferred in a will. All right, same way they thought of slavery was. The master was obligated to feed and clothe the servant and to give him certain freedom dues, corn, clothes, and in some cases land. At the end of his service, remember they got 50 acres if you survived. But there is plenty of evidence to show that masters did not always live up to their obligations. Some, in fact, did everything they could to extend the service of their servants. I remember they did whatever they could to try to keep them under this indenture, under this contract for life. They knew they had them only for 7 years, but they would try to extend that, and it happened more to people of color. That's why you think slavery only happened to so-called Negroes. As a result, many servants who survived the first term were tricked, forced, or penalized into second and third terms. It was also common for poor whites to voluntarily sell themselves into servitude to pay debts, including medical expenses. In 1675 in Virginia, a white man named Lambert Groton voluntarily sold himself into lifetime slavery in order to satisfy a debt of 3,200 pounds. You hear that? Servants held a variety of jobs. Some were teachers, some were bartenders, some were artisans. Most, however, were field hands. Again, most, though, were working in the plantations alongside any person of color. They were in the plantations, in the field. They were field hands. And most worked the traditional slave hours from can see to can't see. In the field house, the servant worked side by side with black and red servants and slaves. Again, black servants, not slaves, servants. Servants and slaves shared the same holidays and the same feast. They lived together in primitive huts they were forced to build. Occasionally, servants, black and white, male and female, lived in the same house with masters. E.I. McCormick said they labored side by side, the servant for a term of years, the slave for life, and the tendency was for many masters to treat them all alike. It was not unusual for a master to make a black or red man overseer of the white workers. Again, it was not what unusual. We're talking about black masters, white servants. It was not usual for a master to make a black or red man overseer of the white workers, nor was it unusual in the early part of the century for a black man to own white servants. Again, it was not usual. We already know this. The first person who actually owned a slave for life, Anthony Johnson, right? So-called colored man. We know there was wealthy so-called black plantation owners with so-called slaves or indentured servants. And again, this person in this article in the Ebony magazine from 1969 is letting you know facts. Nor was it unusual in the early part of the century for a black man to own white servants. This is part 4, all right, of white servitude, black masters. All right, so now I want to read this article to you guys, and it's from the Louisiana History, the Journal of the Louisiana Historical Association, Volume 40, Number 2. This is from spring 1999. You can find this article on pages 133 to 153. It's about 21 pages, it says here. And this is the name of the article, Sally Muller, The White Slave, by Carol Wilson. It says here, a white skin is no security whatsoever. I should no more dare to send white children out to play alone, especially at night, than I should dare send them into a forest of tigers and hyenas. Parker Pillsbury to William Lloyd Garrison, 1853. One day in the spring of 1843, Mrs. Carl Roof, a German immigrant, went into a cafe on Levee Street in New Orleans. The slave who served her looked familiar, and eventually Madame Carl, as she was known, realized that the woman was one of her compatriots, Salome Muller. The two had last seen each other more than 2 decades earlier, when both arrived in the city with several hundred other Germans. All right, so remember these Palatines, thousands of them coming over here, hundreds of them. I don't know if these are specifically Palatines, but we know a lot of Germans. They were all indentured servants. A lot of these Germans were swarthy. We got the references in the newspaper ads and a lot of different descriptions. And so we're talking about indentured servants here, that they're talking about they came together in a ship full of indentured servants. And they remember, the lady remembered the girl she's talking about. Again, they came earlier, both arrived in the city with several hundred other Germans. Muller's mother and infant brother had not survived the voyage. You hear that? So the lady, the girl that she's seen, she knows the story of her mother dying on the voyage, on the way over here through the Middle Passage. Her mom died in the Middle Passage, coming over here, crossing the Atlantic on a ship. Her and her little brother, her mom and her little brother died. All right, and her father and older brother died soon after arrival. Her whole family just died. That was happening massively with these indentured servants. Salome and her sister Dorothea, both under age of 6, had never been seen or heard from again. So these two children were orphaned, and they were Germans. They came in that shipload. The lady remembers. I guess the lady might be a little older, right? But she remembers who these girls are, or the girl that she's talking about, and she remembers they had just disappeared. So now she runs into her, I guess maybe a little older. It says, Madame Carl questioned the slave, who displayed no recollection of her previous life. So she was a slave. We're talking about Germans, right? She explained that she was the property of Louis Belmonte, owner of the cafe. Madame Carl then took Muller to the home of Eve and Francis Schruber, who had traveled on the same voyage. Mrs. Schruber was Muller's cousin and godmother. The Schrubers also positively identified her as the missing girl, Salome, known as Sally. With their help, she sued in court for her freedom, first losing, then winning on appeal to the Louisiana State Supreme Court. You hear this? All right, so they found this German person that came in probably as indentured servants with them, and now she was as a slave owned by this person in Louisiana, and she sued and got her freedom. It says Muller's story was known to 19th century Louisianans, so they knew this, but they never told anybody. And I didn't know about this. In 1889, popular author George Washington Cable published Strange True Stories of Louisiana. It contained a piece entitled Salome Muller, the White Slave, about a German girl who came to Louisiana as a child with her family, and after being orphaned, found herself enslaved. Later, as an adult, she successfully sued in court to regain her freedom. The same year, a German scholar at Tulane University, J. Hanno Dahler, also published an account of the Muller case in a pamphlet on the history of Germans in Louisiana. But since then, the fascinating case has fallen into obscurity. All right, they wanted to put this under the rug, right? Hide this. How could a white person become enslaved in the antebellum United States, in a society that clearly equated slave status with black skin? This is very important right here. So I hope we're dodging the hijack. Now we are to assume, based on what this article is saying, that this German lady is white, right? We are to assume that, all right? We are to assume. We don't know. We don't have a picture of her. We don't know a description of her complexion at a primary source from. Unless there exists, we got to find it, right? I had to dig into that. Just wanted to read this to you. These are real stories. So this is supposedly a white person because she's German. All right, so let's go even with the white thing, right? Now we know there's white slaves, right? She was a white slave. This is a real story. So if you want to believe she was white, we're talking about a white slave then, right? But for me, it's questionable. To me, it's questionable, and I would want to verify what she really looked like. All right, because I know that a lot of times they're just saying white because they were Europeans, or in this case German, but she might have been white. So how could a German immigrant be mistaken for an African American? Gosh, the hijack. See, so they throw in the whole African thing there. So we know there's hijack in these authors, writing. Although certainly not common, Muller's experience was not unique. Oh, it's not just her. And there's a source for that. See, number 5. The enslavement of a white person reveals that American ideas about slavery and race were not nearly as clear-cut as many whites believed. And not just whites, so-called Negroes too, or people of color. They also believe the whole Kunta Kinte thing. They still believe they're coming out of Africa, mostly. And hopefully by now, whoever's been following me for a while understands that you mostly or most likely are from here. Do your genealogy. I don't know. Do case by case. I'm not going to generalize, but just do your genealogy and then you would know. In 1817, the Mullers left their home in the town of Langenscholzbach, Württemberg, part of a large migration of southern Germans during the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, when a reactionary government had instituted press censorship and harassment of intellectuals. Probably more important for the masses, however, was the local economic crisis. Württemberg, like other nearby states, had a large population to support on land poorly suited to agriculture. In 1817, the region experienced one of the most devastating famines in its history. That year alone, over 16,000 people left Württemberg. 16,000 Germans. Where did all these people end up? And how did they make it to America? The Muellers paid full passage to Philadelphia, planning to move west of the city into the farm country inhabited by many of their countrymen. Though some of their Württemberg neighbors were farmers, members of the Muller family were skilled artisans. Sally's father Danny was a shoemaker, his brother Henry a lockmaker. Still, they had been negatively affected by the poor agricultural economy, and in April they set out with a large party of friends and relatives for Amsterdam. Arriving in August, laden with all their worldly possessions, they were sent to Den Helder, the deep water port of the North Sea. Here they remained, along with nearly 900 other anxious passengers aboard the Rudolph 900, a huge Russian ship, and several smaller ships for 3 to 4 months. They were on this ship for 3 to 4 months. Winter was growing near, food supplies were dwindling, and eventually the passengers discovered that they had been swindled. The agent to whom they had paid their passage to the United States had absconded with their money. So all of a sudden they don't have money. So they had a story of them having money, being wealthy. They were just, I don't buy all that. I gotta dig into all that. These sound like people who were poor from the beginning. This put the Muellers, like their relatives and neighbors, in a precarious position. Now they're poor. While not completely impoverished, they had spent their savings booking passage to the United States, traveling to Amsterdam, and buying provisions for the journey. Now those provisions were nearly exhausted. Some of the immigrants resorted to begging in the streets. Eventually, the Dutch government intervened on their behalf and arranged for 3 ships to take them to the United States. They sailed in December of 1817. But the worst was not yet behind the Muellers. Incredibly, the unfortunate travelers faced further hardship. First, they were informed that their destination was no longer Philadelphia, but rather New Orleans. So all of a sudden, they changed their destination, their port. They're like, wait, you guys ain't going to Philly. You're actually going to New Orleans now. They're like, what? Over 1,000 miles farther south, a more striking contrast would have been hard to imagine. So imagine they make it all the way to the East Coast, cross the Atlantic, the Middle Passage. Then they're like, oh, wait, we ain't here yet. We got to go 1,000 miles further south. New Orleans in 1818 was less than 2 decades in American hands and seemed in many ways still a European outpost. Residents spoke French, street signs were in French or Spanish, and even the legal system, as Sally Muller was to discover years later, bore the stamp of the Roman Civil Code. Rather than English common law, Philadelphia, a large, sophisticated, prosperous port, had served previously as the nation's capital and still carried its distinctive Quaker influence. New Orleans was a backwater by contrast, but it had become a boomtown whose population had doubled in the decade after American acquisition. This population was diverse. Particularly surprising to European arrivals was the large number of black and mixed race residents. I wonder who these so-called black and mixed people are. Immigrants' guidebooks warned travelers away from the city during the yellow fever season, extending from May to October. But the change in destination hardly constituted the worst of the immigrants' problems. The voyage itself was nightmarish. While about 900 persons had departed Holland, only about 300 arrived alive in New Orleans on March 6, 1818. Do you hear that? They went through a middle passage, right? About 900 people. And only 300 arrived. That's 600 people died on the way. 600 people died through the middle passage. And we're not talking about, again, Africans here. I know you're like, wow, why does this dude keep saying that? Why is Kurimeo being so disrespectful, hating Africa? No, I'm just telling you real history here, because The false history was pushed on us for years as a child, and that was, traumatizing. That's traumatizing, man. That's brainwashing. And they didn't care. Teachers pushed it on me. They still push it on us right now. You're still arguing, probably a lot of you, like, man, he's fighting with that whole connection to Africa. Well, I'm sure there was some indentured servants coming out of Africa, but that's not the main theme here. That's not the main story here. That's very small numbers compared to the people they were actually using for their indentured servitude and their so-called slavery. Because as it says here, and you talking about Kunta Kinte and all that hardship and cramped in ships and all that, we're talking about 900 people, only 300 people arriving. That means 600 people died in this middle passage. 600 Germans, and a lot of those Germans were probably colored people too. But no, let's not care about them because they're German. We only care about if an African came over and died on the middle passage. Not if a black Irish or a black English or a black German came. Oh, but you do care, right? You do care. I know you care. So, we got to pay attention to all this. Don't leave out this story. Don't leave out these people. They went through this. Some of these people might be your ancestors. The journey to a new life brought death instead for many passengers, including Dorothea Mueller, Sally's mother, and her infant child. Remember, they died on the way. That was one of the 600. There was 2 of the 600 passengers, named Daniel after his father. Like others who had died, they were buried at sea. They were thrown over, remember? Oh, they told us that happened in Roots. They told us that was only in Africans. No, that was happening to Europeans and in their middle passage coming over here as indentured servants. The cause of these 2 deaths, as well as the other passengers, is not fully known, but starvation clearly played a part. Most of the food supplies had been used up while the ill-starved passengers waited at Den Helder. Those who were already ill or weakened, as Dorothea Mueller likely was, having given birth prior to the journey, were particularly vulnerable. At least the arriving Germans were not alone. Since the early 18th century, Louisiana had attracted German immigrants. And antebellum New Orleans, all right, we're talking about indentured servants, thousands and thousands of them in Louisiana. Where are they? Where's their descendants? You're saying it's all the white people that are there? I honestly, I believe a lot of those are colored Germans, Swarthy, and they call it so-called Negro today. In antebellum New Orleans, they congregated in Lafayette, a suburb, absorbed by the expanded metropolis. Lafayette became the 4th municipality in 1852, and in the Faubourg Marigny, the city's 3rd municipality. By 1839, the German community had its own German language newspaper, and in 1847, a German society had organized to help immigrants. But this was of little help to the Mueller family. The surviving Mueller's father, Daniel, and his 3 young children, Jacob, Dorothea, and Sally, prepared to start a new life in what for them was a new world. But trouble still plagued them. Although Dutch government had paid full passage for the Muellers and their compatriots who had already paid passage once, at least one captain tried to get more, claiming that the immigrants were responsible for paying their way. So, they're saying that these people had the Dutch government pay for them. Now, let's look at this historically more accurately. So, the Dutch government would probably most likely pay their passage again, as other governments and other companies were doing with everybody else, because they would have to come here and work as indentured servants and pay that back. Remember, that's the whole point of indentured servants. They're leaving this out of here. There's a whole thing. This person's trying to sugarcoat her family's history because supposedly she's white, and she might be white, and even if she was white, she's trying to sugarcoat that somehow she fell into slavery, and it's not supposed to happen. So the Dutch government paid for their passage for no reason, right? Just because, hey, here, we're cool. We feel so bad for you. Let me pay for the passage over there. We got all this extra money. We don't want it back. Don't worry. Don't pay us back. So that's not reality, right? They were indentured servants. And that's why this captain was probably saying these immigrants were responsible for paying their way. Captain Gradsteer of the Juffer Johanna arranged to sell some of the Germans into indentured servitude through advertisements in a local newspaper. So now all of a sudden, he's just going to do it. I'm just going to sell you as an indentured servant. No, these people came in as indentured servants. That's how they came over here. That's how they paid their pass. That's what they promised. That was the contract they had, even with whoever paid for them or the captain, as redemptioneers or as indentured servants. Although more commonly associated with early colonial settlement of the eastern seaboard states, indentured servitude was still a source of labor in the 19th century. Again, was still a source of labor. Was still a source of labor. So when we're talking about since 1607 all the way into the 1800s, a source of labor was what? Indentured servitude, not Africa. The abolition of the international slave trade in 1808 had heightened interest in alternative methods of acquiring workers. The region of Germany from which the Müllers hailed, ravaged by war and famine, was a particular target of ship owners and their agents. You see, they were going to get these people over there because they knew they needed help. They knew these people were going through some bad stuff. They're like, yo, we can grab all those Germans over there. They'll definitely be willing to cross over here. Those two port-to-pay passage across the Atlantic could obtain transportation by selling their labor, usually for 3 to 8 years, like I was explaining. These people didn't just come here, and this Dutch company didn't just like, oh yeah, we're going to pay for you to go over there. Don't worry, have a Merry Christmas. At the end of their terms, they were to be redeemed, hence the term commonly applied to them, redemptioneers. Redeem. The system was abusive enough, however, to incite public outrage, and several states passed laws to regulate it, as Louisiana did immediately after the case of the Müllers and their compatriots attracted journalistic attention. Such action came too late, though, to help the Müllers despite protests by immigrants and their defenders in New Orleans, and even a court inquiry which should have shown clearly that they were being swindled yet again. Some of these unlucky passengers among them found themselves indentured, the Müller family included. Less than a month after their first sight of America at the Belize, the Müllers were journeying upriver to either the Atacapas region, the south-central portion of the state known for cattle raising, or nearby Opelousas. Their services apparently having been purchased by a farmer. Their services, they were indentured servants, they're slaves. Impossible though it seems, even further tragedy awaited the Müllers. Daniel Müller died on the trip. Reports identity the cause of his death variously as drowning, fever, or apoplexy. What? His young son Jacob fell overboard and drowned. Accidents were not uncommon for boat travelers at that time. According to historian Donald J. Millett, rivers and bayous deviled boat captains by the existence of snags, log jams, and falling and overhanging trees that were a constant menace to navigation. What became of the two little orphan girls was not known. Numerous friends and relatives searched for them, but they vanished without a trace until Madame Carl's shocking discovery of Sally a quarter century later. All right, so that was the whole backstory behind how this person ended up there and who she was. How did Sally, age 4, when she was orphaned, become a slave? The answer is not known. Now they don't know. See, they're trying to pretend that European or white people wasn't slaves, just like the so-called Negro. They're trying to pretend on this article because they historically found somebody who was under this status. So how did she become a slave? The answer is not known. For at this time of her disappearance, while en route westward, she also disappears from the historical records. She reappears 4 years later, listed on a deed of sale from slave trader Anthony Williams of Mobile, Alabama, to John Fitz Miller of New Orleans. Exactly how she came into Williams' possession is not clear, but it is possible to surmise. A young child orphan, speaking no English, indentured to a farmer in an isolated rural area of the state, was easily exploited. All right, they're letting you know. So she says, we don't know, the answer is not known, but she knows. It's logical, right? You got to be, if you be historic and logical, that's basically what you conclude. That's the most logical thing, that she was exploited, continued exploited as an indentured servant and sold. who would protect her rights? The kidnapping of free black children into slavery was not uncommon. Apparently, it could happen to whites as well. Apparently, it can happen to German and European indentured servants, yes, as well. Sally Miller spent most of her life in Louisiana as the slave of John Fitz Miller. From 1822 to 1838, Miller worked for Miller and his widowed mother, Sarah Canby. As the slave of John Miller, Sally was known as Sally Miller. But for reasons of clarity, this writer has chosen to refer to her by her original name of Muller. John Fitz Miller was one of the New Orleans' prominent citizens, a wealthy businessman. He started out in the lumber trade, establishing a sawmill in the city. As he prospered, Miller expanded his enterprises, adding a second sawmill, a sugar mill, and a rum distillery. He also acquired a good deal of land in the Atacapos region. Like Sally, he was not a native of New Orleans. Ironically, he came from Philadelphia, the city she and her family had been trying to reach. Never married, Miller lived with his mother in the Crescent City and later at several residences across the state, including one at New Iberia and one on what is today called Jefferson Island, where Miller helped found a resort and thoroughbred racetrack. Sally worked as a house servant, and if accounts of Miller's friends are to be believed, she, like his and his mother's other slaves, was not particularly ill-treated. While in Miller's service, she gave birth to 3 children. The first, Lafayette, born in 1825, and in 1838, Miller sold Muller to Louis Belmonte, who ran a cafe in Fogbourn, Marigny. So she was being sold, right, like property. She was sold. She was being treated like a slave. This German person, right, being sold. Now she's owned by this guy, Louis Belmonte, with a cafe close to Miller's New Orleans mill and residence. She had been working 6 years for her new owner when she filed her lawsuit. After being discovered by her long-lost German friends, Sally Muller sued Louis Belmonte and John Fitz Miller in district court on the grounds that she was a free white woman and had been illegally held in slavery. Her case was argued by a team of lawyers, including Christian Roselius, considered one of the most brilliant attorneys in Louisiana's history. Roselius, at that time of the trial, had just finished serving as the state's attorney general. He was later a delegate to 2 state constitutional conventions and was professor and dean of the University of Louisiana, now Tulane University Law School. But he, like his client, had humble origins. Born in Bremen, Germany, in 1803, Roselius had come to New Orleans in 1819 as a redemptioneer. So even this guy, who was wealthy and a lawyer and all that, he was a indentured servant / slave too. So she went to court, right, to sue this John Miller. Now, in his defense, listen to what he says about her, all right? It says, in his defense, John Miller claimed that the plaintiff was not Sally Muller, but rather a mulatress slave. Mulatress, mulatto, mulatress. Oh, so she's not even that light skin, huh? So she looks like a mulatto, mulatress slave. So she's mixed. So I thought she was German. There was nowhere saying that she was mixed or her parents were mixed. Remember, her parents, both her parents were German. They came on the same ship. They weren't mixed. They were both described as German. There's nowhere saying that either one was this and the other one was black or African or anything like that. So both her parents were German, right? Same people. So why was he saying she was a mulatress slave? Was she swarthy, a little dark skinned? Was she a little dark skinned? He says that she was known either as Bridget or Mary Bridget, whom he had acquired through legal means in 1822. He denied any knowledge of her prior to that time. Defense witnesses made assertions as to Miller's and his mother's good character and refuted the prosecution's statement. So he was trying to make this up. Like, nope, I got her legally, whatever. But eventually she won the court case again. Now continuing, listen to this. Several witnesses attested to the plaintiff's appearance being in accord with that of a non-white person. A non-white person. She wasn't white fully. You hear what they're saying? People who had known her when she worked for Miller assumed that she was a mixed race, colored, or quadroon. A colored person, colored person. She's a German. Both her parents are German. They all thought she was colored, a mixed race, or a quadroon, or a person of color mixed with something. She wasn't white, pale skin. She was swarthy a little bit. All right. This is what I've been trying to tell you in this whole article, and I didn't know this about her. I hadn't read this whole article fully until I started recording this, and now I'm reading it with you because I just the first couple of pages was good, so I knew the whole thing was going to be good. And now, what I was saying is that she could have been colored. We're assuming she's white, just because she's German and both her parents are German. But now we know there's even word of her in these court cases. There's sources for this. Her being called colored. We thought she was colored. Oh, we didn't know she was white. We thought she was colored. One added that he had seen slaves whiter than she. Some people said that they've seen other slaves even whiter than her. You hear that? So clearly these people were not shocked by the existence of slaves who physically looked to be white. It was apparently not a unique experience. Again, this is not a unique case. There was thousands and thousands of, yes, white pale-skinned Europeans or light-skinned people, colored people, anybody who can pass as a European or white that were also under indentured servitude. So the article continues. It basically sums up that it basically became about her being white or classified as a white person, and she was German and not Negro. So that was the biggest question, that if they admit that she was the person they say she was, then they would have to admit that not only Negroes were slaves or something like that, or that she didn't have that status of life should tell. She was an indentured servant, and eventually sometimes she should have been freed and not been sold like property. All right, I want to read this book now. It's called White Servitude in Colonial South Carolina by Warren B. Smith. This is from the University of South Carolina Press. This is from 1961, and these are the contents of the book. All right, we're in the introduction of the book, and it gets to this part here. I want to read. It says, one perceptive student of South Carolina history had tried in October 1911 to refute Lowell's statement that having white indentured servants in South Carolina was an impossibility. All right, so before that they were explaining how people were trying to deny that it existed. All right, so this person is basically showing something else. Theodore Jervey presented as evidence of the existence of the institution the fact that 32 Scottish servants had been purchased in 1716 by the governor for the protection of the frontier. However, when Elizabeth Donnan was investigating the subject in 1920, she went back to the Bassett thesis that white indentured servants had been brought in originally but had been outnumbered very soon by the slaves. She used as evidence of the growing black population the fact that in 1698 an act for the encouragement of the importation of white servants had been passed, which was designed to maintain the same balance between Negroes and white servants as had existed in the first years of the colony. Now they're talking about Europeans when they're saying white. It says here, chapter 1, the introduction of white indentured servants. All right, it says the province of Carolina was settled more than 60 years after Virginia and 40 years after Barbados. It was natural that the land of rice should fall heir to some of the institutions of the land of tobacco and the land of sugar. Negro slaves had been introduced into Virginia in 1619. All right, so we already know who they were. They were also indentured servants, not slaves. They were indentured servants. All right. Watch the hijack in the book. We're gonna pull out the babies out of this book. All right, but by 1649, their number had increased only to 300. And when they say Negro, they're talking about other Aboriginals they're bringing in from the Caribbean, not directly from Africa. In 1670, the year of the first settlement on the banks of the Ashley, there were in Virginia but 2,000 slaves. All right, are you sure? Because 1670, I bet you most of these or all of these were indentured servants. Virginia had not, therefore, at the time of the first settlements in Carolina, definitely decided in favor of Negro slaves. They hadn't, no Negro slaves in the West Indian colonies. While the superiority of Negro labor had already been demonstrated, white servants were still used in large numbers, even in the field work of the plantations. All right, whites in the plantation. Now, when they say Negro, remember, they were bringing also colored Europeans. They're adding these colored Europeans to the Negro population. All right, so-called Negro. They're mixing a lot of people from England, Black Scots, Black Irish, Black Germans, even North Africans, Aboriginals here from America. They're called Negro. They're mixing them all together and calling them Negroes, and then they would transport them up to the North American colonies. And then you forget who they really were or what they really were. And everybody's just a Negro now. So this is what they mean when only they're bringing up 300 Negroes, right? And in the new colony, whose beginnings fell in the period when the use of white servants was perhaps at its height, naturally took very kindly to such labor. The first fleet to sail for Carolina stopped at the island of Barbados to pick up men and supplies. Thus, many of the first settlers of Carolina came from Barbados. We already know they were sending so many European indentured servants and convicts and all these people, rebels, political prisoners to Barbados from England and Ireland. In the proposals of the Barbados men to settle in Carolina can be found the statement, "There are many hundreds of noble families and well-experienced planters that are ready to move speedily, thither with negroes and servants." The public records of England indicate quite clearly that many, many white servants were sent to Barbados, like I was just letting you know, right? This is history. All right, so who were they really bringing up from Barbados? You think it was Africans? In March 1655, the Council of State directed the governor of Tynemouth Castle to certify the number of prisoners taken at Dunbar, that they might be sent to Barbados. All right, in August 1655, the Council of State ordered the transportation to Barbados of all prisoners lately committed to the Marshalsea who were taken in the breastman of war. In September 1655, the Council of State commanded the commissioners of the Admiralty to give orders for those English, Scotch, Irish, and Dutch mariners, prisoners in the Castle of Plymouth, to be sent to Barbados. All right, like I was just saying. All right, this is real history. It's not Africans they're sending to Barbados. In 1661, the Council and Assembly of Barbados passed an act for the good governance of servants. Now remember, we're talking about 1600s. Remember, let's not leave out all the New England tribes and all the American Indian people that were being sent down to Barbados as well. During the latter half of the 17th century, a constant stream of petitions flowed from Barbados, requesting the sending out of white servants. These facts are proof of the acceptance of the institution of white servitude by the Barbadians, and therefore indirectly by the first settlers of South Carolina. It would not be unreasonable to expect that among the Carolina immigrants were some who were already serving indentures and inured to the conditions of such servitude. All right, it's not unreasonable to expect that these immigrants were indentured servants. These first settlers were indentured servants themselves. This is not merely a matter of inference. Proof can be found in the passenger list of the Carolina, one of the 3 ships that sailed for Carolina from England. Again, from England in 1699. I bet you they're gonna find colored people in that ship, and they're not Africans. In this ship, there were 16 passengers who brought a total of 63 servants, as well as 13 passengers who had no servants. The complete list of names follows. All right, and this is the names: Captain Sullivan. All right, I guess these are the people and their servants. All right. So we're assuming these are all white people. This is what we're assuming. But don't assume that. There's colored people in here too. Some more families right here, and owners and servants. Again, not all these people are pale skinned. There's colored people in here. Possibly all kinds: Protestants, Quakers, Germans, Irish, Sephardic, Jews, Moriscos, whatever. These are the passengers that didn't have no servants, it says. All right, they probably came in as indentured too. It is true that no statement is made as to the character of service to be rendered by these servants. Possibly some of the above were paid personal servants, but the more likely presumption is that many of them were indentured servants. That's the reality. Just prior to the departure of this fleet, the proprietors had offered a head right of 150 acres of land to every freeman coming out before March 25th, 1670. Again, 150 acres of whose land? Whose land they're taking and giving away to these indentured servants as a head right system, like as freedom dues for completing their time and or for setting up a plantation. plus 150 acres for every able manservant carried with him, and 100 acres for every woman servant, and for every manservant under 16. You hear this? The amount of land to be granted for transporting servants was to be reduced each year for 2 consecutive years. The greatest advantage therefore pertained to bringing servants to the province during the first year. Continuing further down, says the Carolina, again the ship that brought these servants from England, still under the command of Henry Brain, returned in the fall of 6070 to Barbados to pick up second load of colonists, right, so-called colonists. Among these were indentured servants. Probably most of them were indentured servants they were going to go pick up. They needed labor. Their names and the time that each had yet to serve were proved before Thomas Gray. So again, this is an example. Thomas Whitty, a sawyer, is to serve 2 years. He still had 2 years left. He was serving time. Toaz Patterson, a carpenter, is to serve 2 years. All right, so these are the examples. So you see, these people were being sold and transported like property, and their service basically be sold. John Radcliffe, the last named, developed a decided passion for troublemaking and occupied considerable space in the early records of the colony. Indentured servants were among the earliest arrivals in Carolina, both from the mother country and from the islands. All right, from the islands. What? Caribbean islands, mother country. They're not talking about Mama Africa here. They're talking about mother country, their mother country, England, the mother country, the British Isles. And then what islands? The Caribbean. They ain't talking about Africa here. So again, the labor, the indentured servants / slaves that they were using, again, were from the mother country and England or the Caribbean. They weren't coming directly from Africa. That's the reason. We're on part 4 of this White Servitude Black Master video series. There's so many books. I can do so many series, but I just want you to, hopefully it's clear by now. And if you're doing the numbers and you see I'm going to different states, different references, different sources saying the same thing. Where's the Africans come in at all? The reason for the introduction of white servants into South Carolina fall under the 3 general heads: to aid in the settlement of the country. All right, they needed to create colonies and plantations, right, to meet the labor shortage. All right, well, so why didn't they just go to Africa then? No, they had their own labor, right? They had local labor here, the aboriginals, and they had their own undesirables and convicts and all these people they needed to bring over here and get rid of, and to defend the colony. The initial need, of course, was for the settlement of the country. We continue in the book White Servitude in Colonial South Carolina. All right, very scholarly book from the University of South Carolina, and these are just copies of indentures. It says indentures of white servants were copied in the records of the Register and Secretary of the Province, now in the South Carolina Archive. These two, dated 1669 and 1671-72, were among the first recorded. So they're talking about this one right here, and this one says this indenture. All right, starts out with that. There's another one right here, this indenture. It says above, another early indenture dated 1673. The inventory below is proof positive that there were white servants in South Carolina in 1718. All right, 1718 still what? White servitude. Where's the Africans? Right now, so how do they get white people from this? Right, where do you see the people? So they're saying white. Remember, they're saying white because these are Europeans. So we are to assume that these are all white people. All right, but yes, a lot of these were white people. I'm just saying, don't leave out the colored Europeans. In the book White Servitude in Colonial South Carolina, says in February 1750, the report of the committee in charge of the general security, health, and convenience of the inhabitants of Charlestown recommended that in view of the excessive number of slaves, some proper restraint may be put on this growing evil to reduce the present number, and that all due encouragement may be given to white inhabitants to reside in the said town. All right, so they wanted to actually have more white servants than so-called Negro ones, because I guess there was, they were worried about the numbers. There was too many so-called Negroes around. So it says, it is proposed that all white persons who will accept any servile labor, such as porter, shall have the preference to all jobs that offer and be entitled to an additional hire per diem. So they were given the jobs first. All right, you see how they start creating the segregation. In the light of the above, the Acadians should have been welcomed to South Carolina in the 1750s. They were not, though. All right, who's the Acadians? However, for they were looked upon as filth column, filth, French Catholics who might stir up the Indians and slaves. All right, so now remember, most of these Acadians were actually Huguenots, Protestants. Who's the Huguenots? I'm gonna go more in depth in another video, future video, hopefully in the next video. All right, but we've mentioned it already, and I've been showing you that a lot of these we're gonna show French Huguenots might be very Morisco, Moorish, or Sephardic from Spain that had inhabited that part of France, mixed with the French people that were there and become Huguenots and all that, and eventually come over here to South Carolina. In June 1756, Governor Littleton reported that the whole number landed here was 1,023, of whom 109 have died, and 273 have been shipped off or made their escape. Some had been put to work on fortifications, but their behavior was disquieting, largely by reason of their own claim that they were prisoners of war. They did not come as servants. They were people who had been forcibly disposed, all right, these prisoners of war, these rebels, right? Perhaps no other colony could have handled the matter as South Carolina finally did. In 1712, the care of the poor had been put under the charge of vestries and church wardens. So when the Acadians became charity cases, the obligation for their keep became largely an item of parish administration. The French Huguenots, again, I was just saying, right? The French Huguenots had settled along the Santee River. So it is not surprising to find Acadians sent to Prince Frederick Winya. The vestry books of this parish record a number of large families, apportioned among the regular parishioners. On April 4th, 1759, over 3,000 pounds was allowed for maintenance of the French Acadians. All right, look at the parentheses, right? French Acadians, what are they really? 2/3 of this went to the church wardens of St. Philip's, Charlestown. Continuing the book, White Servitude in Colonial South Carolina. We're in chapter 4, and it says here, sources of supply. Right? After consideration of the various reasons for introducing white servants, attention should next be given to the sources from which they were drawn. Disbanded soldiers, defeated rebels, orphans, convicts, destitute Irish, and poor Protestants made up the more important contributing groups. In 1697, the Council of Trade and Plantations was concerned whether the king would be pleased to be at the charge of transporting any disbanded soldiers to the colonies. The end of the war in Europe should have provided an opportunity at this time for new servants. Convicts were among those brought out of Carolina as servants. All right, an advertisement was run in the Gazette during the fall of 1739 for 2 runaways from Virginia. 2 years later, Robert Ellicott, a convict felon, was advertised for in the same newspaper. One report from Georgia referred to Thomas Wright, a transported convict who had gone with several traders to Carolina. Yet on the whole, the average servant in South Carolina was perhaps of a higher type than those in the other colonies. At least the leaven of social outcasts was remarkably few, as far as the records of the colony indicate. It says here in 1672, Jamaica declared that whereas diverse thefts, felonies, and other enormities have been committed lately on Port Royal, which cannot be imputed to anything but the greater number of malefactors and other convicts yearly brought from His Majesty's prisons in England. Where's the descendants for all these people? Shouldn't Jamaica be more white? Now, all these Jamaicans, are they all aboriginal? And that's what I'm trying to let you guys to think about. All right, and it's not to bash anybody, to make anybody feel any less aboriginal, but look into your own family history. And you might have melanated Europeans as your ancestors. We're talking about so-called Negroes, Europeans, or so-called Black Irish, Black English, Black Scottish people, coming down or being sent to Jamaica as convicts, rebels that they lost. Remember Monmouth's rebellion, all these things. Undesirables. It says the destitute Irish represented another important source of servants. Right, the Irish, right? The presence of large numbers of destitute people at home had provided a supply, especially in the early 17th century when the economic writers still felt England to be overpopulated. With the coming of the Industrial Revolution, ideas about overpopulation changed. There was less reason to believe that England was overpopulated, and therefore the destitute Irish became a principal source of indentured servants for the colonies. Remember, there was many people living in Ireland already that had been outcasted to Ireland from England, from Scotland, Germany, France, all these places. Many of these servants were carried out to the colonies, and a lot of these people were carried out to what? The American colonies by merchants looking for an outward bound cargo, simply to make money out of their passage rather than to sail in ballast. The bulky products, of course, were those carried on the homeward bound voyage. The sugar, rice, and tobacco of the southern colonies. The arrival of these Irish servants was often advertised in the Gazette. An example was the notice of men and women servants from Dublin aboard a ship in the harbors, among whom were some tradesmen. Merchants were not always responsible for their coming, although usually they acted as intermediaries. Samuel Wiley, for instance, brought servants over who had been indentured to him in Ireland. Hugh Conhary and Cornelius Mellon and wife arrived in the situation about 1751, and 4 years later they had served their time and were given lands in Craven County and on the Watery River at the mouth of 25 Mile Creek, respectively. All right, so these were indentured servant Irish people who worked for 4 years that they had left, and then they got their freedom, and then they got land. And then you forgot that they were indentured servants. Wiley incidentally became a trader on the Pine Tree Creek, later the Camden area. Other instances were Dennis Hagen, bound to Robert Belton in Ireland, 50 acres in Craven County, 1755, and John Dowland, bound to Robert Millhouse in Dublin for 4 years, was given 50 acres on the Santee River, or the waters thereof, 1755. The mercantile firms, as importers of servants, were not too careful about their treatment, as the more important purpose of the transaction was to get ships over to South Carolina, which could carry local produce back to Europe. Consequently, the Irish, as well as others, suffered greatly. This was particularly true during the period when slave importations into Carolina had been prohibited. It was almost as if the British merchants had redirected their vessels from the African coast to the Irish coast. They had redirected. They were never going over there, at least not to bring anybody to America, with the white servants coming over in much the same fashion as the African slaves. What African slaves? But they're telling you straight up right here. I pulled the baby from the water. All right, they're letting you know, same thing. Just like they were treating the indentured servants, it was the same, cramming them up in these ships, bringing them in these horrible conditions. Nathaniel Russell described in 1767, just after coming to Charlestown as agent for Rhode Island merchants, the barbarous conditions under which the Irish were brought in. About 6 weeks passed, a ship arrived here from Belfast with a number of passengers. The owners of merchants there being very anxious to procure as many passengers as possible. Instead of 200, which was the most they could bring with comfort, they brought out 450, and their agreement was for 19 inches room and width for each person, but they scarcely had 7. There being so much crowded and the bad usage they met with from the master of the ship, who cut them off in their allowances of provision, almost 3/4 brought on a distemper, which carried off upwards of 100 on the passage. The survivors were in a most pitiful condition. When they arrived here, there were many parents who buried all their children, and many children without parent, friend, or relation. As soon as they landed, they were ordered into the barracks. The church wardens immediately carried about subscriptions to raise a sum of money for their relief, and in 2 days had upwards of £200 sterling subscribed exclusively of blankets, linen, cloths, and every necessary that the sick and naked stood in need of. You see how they were bringing these people over here, right? Continuing the book, White Servitude in Colonial South Carolina from the University of South Carolina. We're in chapter 5, and they continue talking about the sources of different indentured servants. And this is about the poor Protestants of Europe. All right, they say it's here by far the largest number, and certainly the most important group of the white indentured servants were the poor Protestants from Europe. All right, so real quick, I want you to dodge the hijack big time, because I've been trying to tell you, remember when I say Protestants, keep that in mind for my next videos when we're talking about the French Huguenots, who were also Protestants, and who these Protestants really were all these people of pale or white complexion? No, history tells us a lot of these Protestants, especially the Huguenots, The Huguenots were mixed with a lot of Moriscos and Sephardic Jews who had converted over to Christianity. All right, so dodge the hijack on bigger, but letting you know that a very large percentage of these indentured servants were so-called white indentured Protestants from Europe. So remember that for our future videos. These were largely voluntary immigrants seeking to escape a condition become intolerable at home because of economic, religious, and political oppression. As these conditions were more or less prevalent in all parts of the European world, there was a sprinkling of many nationalities among the colony servant class. Of course, since the Catholics were discouraged from coming, the immigrants were representative of the northern Protestant nations. After a search of the Gazette, the following breakdown of nationalities can be made. It says here, table 4, nationalities of servants. It says German, including Dutch, 29, Irish, 25, English, 21, Scotch, 15, Welsh, 7, Swiss, 4, French, 4, Portuguese, 3, Scot-Irish, 2, Virginian, 2, New Englander, 1, Norwegian. All right, so the individual references were as follows. Nationalities represented among white servants, names appearing in the Gazette. All right, so and this is an ad from 1749. It says, to be sold on board the Georgetown Galley. That's the ship. Thomas Crathmade, master line at the Franklin's Wharf, sundry English servants, men, women, well recommended, amongst whom are tradesmen, husbandmen, and indented for 4 years. Says here, another one, runaway, 3 white servants. Oh, this is a runaway ad. Check it out. It says, runaway, 3 white servants, lately imported. So 3 runaway white servants. All right. This is an ad about the German Palatine servants. All right. So all these ads existed in these years. It says down here, the arrival of servants was advertised in postscript to the South Carolina Gazette, November 27, 1749 above, and they ran away. The Gazette notified South Carolinians to be on the lookout for them. So, okay, so these people, same people that had gone in there from England, had run away right away. You see that? Right away as soon as they got here. These ain't Africans. And continuing the book regarding the Protestants, right? I just want to get some numbers here of certain ships loads of Protestants. So, quoting here, it says, just before this act was passed, the governor announced to the council that 2 vessels are at present in this harbor with upward of 800 foreign Protestants on board, and 2 others are hourly expected with the like number. Ships, you hear this, right? Vessels with 800 people, and they were expecting more coming in. So these are all servants, right? What they would call slaves, indentured servants. Where's the Africans? Continuing, says January 31st, 1753, says thus Ross and ship Elizabeth arrived from Rotterdam with 319 Protestants on board from Germany. All right, where all these people pale skin or white just because they were coming from Germany. That's what you got. That's the hijack you got to dodge. This is what I'm trying to make you aware of. We can't assume these were all white people. I know in this book it keeps saying white servitude, white, because they want you to think that everybody in Europe was white, just like they want you to think that everybody who's being called Negro was from Africa, and that's not true. It's the same thing. All right. So look at all these numbers, all these shiploads of these Europeans coming as indentured servants. This is the labor force, not Africans. This is 1753. 1753. Why are you paying people? Because you got to pay these people, right? You got to give them their freedom dues. Why are you still paying them when you got Africans? Free labor. It says down here, Ms. Jenny Reville has compiled a list of many German, Irish, and French Protestants. All of the important groups that came in from February 19, 1763 through January 23, 1773 are listed below. February 19, 1763, 70 Irish petitions for lands in Boonesborough Township. And it says here, and given the date, you see the date, 89 poor Protestants from Ireland, 150 poor Protestants from Ireland. And different date here, 45 Germans petitioned for land. It says here 81 French Protestants, these French Protestants, these Huguenots. All right, December 24, 1764, 56 German Protestants. Over here it says 306 Germans, 59 German, 80 Irish Protestants, 192 Germans from Rotterdam, 51 Irish, 128 Germans from Amsterdam, 155 Germans, 172 Irish, 227 Irish. Look at the dates. 437 Irish, 201 Irish, look, these are Protestants supposedly, 414 Irish, the dates, 268 Irish, 231, 238, all right, you see the number 418 Irish. The evidence is thus plentiful that thousands of poor Protestants, thousands of poor Protestants came to Carolina as indentured servants or as redemptioneers. Again, they're letting you know in this book that there's strong evidence that thousands and thousands of poor Protestants came into Carolina as indentured servants. This is just the Protestants. All right, every other group is not even being counted that came to Carolina right now. All right, so remember that all these Protestants, South Carolina, we're going to get this in another video, the French Huguenots, what they have to do in South Carolina, and who are they? Protestants as well. All right, so now I wanted to read from this article. It's called Plantation Production and White Proto-Slavery, White Indentured Servants and the Colonization of English West Indies, 1624-1645, all right? So indentured servants where? In the Caribbean, West Indies, plantation and production in white proto-slavery. And this is from the Americas, volume 41, number 3, from January 1985. You can find this on pages 21 to 45, about 25 pages, published by the Cambridge University Press. So it says here, the effective colonization of these islands, and they're saying St. Christopher, which is St. Kitts, in 1624, Barbados, 1627, Nevis, 1628, Montserrat and Antigua in 1632. Remember that Montserrat, we did we covered that, it was indentured servants, Irish indentured servants that were sent over there. And remember the guy was saying that it was supposedly for 100 years, the first 100 years, it was a white colony. It was all indentured servants of white people because they were Irish, they were saying white, but these were also, included people of color, and a lot of these so-called Montserrat people are the original Black Irish, actually, and they don't, they celebrate it, they say, go to St. Patrick's Day in Montserrat, you'll see what I'm talking about. So, and continues, says, what's possible, so these islands were possible because of early emergence of large plantations, which were clearly designed for large-scale production and the distribution of commodities upon the world market. They were instrumental in forging an effective and profitable agrarian culture out of the unstable frontier environment of the 17th century Caribbean. These plantations therefore preceded the emergence of the sugar industry and the general use of African slave labor. So they're saying, we're going to dodge the hijack. Again, what's African slave labor? It's a very small percentage. We're talking about European indentures and the Aboriginals in America being put into an indenture as well. But again, they're letting you know in this article, right, that this indenture service, this preceded, all right, this was before these agrarian culture plantations, these plantations that preceded were before so-called Africans were coming, before, all right, their whole story. Kunta Kinte, right? They developed during the formative years when the production of tobacco, cotton, and indigo dominated land use and utilized predominantly European indentured labor, okay? Predominantly European indentured labor, all right? This is the real, these were the people. So when they're telling you they founded all these with African slaves, Barbados was founded by, and all these islands were founded by, that's a lie. They're telling you straight up right here. It was indentured servants, and we already know. This is again part 4 of this series. We've already read out numerous sources telling the same thing. The structure of land distribution and the nature of land tenure systems in the pre-sugar era illustrate this. Most planters who accelerated the pace of economic growth in the late 1640s and early 1650s by the production of sugar and black slave labor, so-called black, dodged the hijack. We already know indentured servitude continued up until the 1800s. Already owned substantial plantations stocked with large numbers of indentured servants, right? So even before they keep trying to throw in those tags, African, black, they're letting you know the drop in between, that these plantations were stocked with what? Large number of indentured servants, not Africans, stocked with indentured servants. continuing in this article in part 2, it says the system of commodity production was built upon the labor of thousands of indentured servants imported from England, Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. All right. These were the people that were supplying these Caribbean plantations, the early colonies with, and it was Europeans, again, not Africans. Unlike the Spanish settlements in the Greater Antilles, Barbados and the Leeward were not densely populated with Indians who could be reduced to chattel slavery. All right. So unlike, again, what are they letting you know here? Major drop right here. Like, again, like I told you in my video, you know, who the Spanish and Portuguese were really enslaving. Who were they really enslaving? When they're talking about all these so-called Negroes that the Spanish and the Portuguese were supposedly transporting everywhere in all their colonies, these were Indians. Like they're letting you know here, it's not like the Spanish settlements, right? Which they had what? A bunch of Indians to what? Enslave or put into chattel slavery, or right? The Aboriginals. They weren't talking about Africans there either. The islands were part of the wider environmental and political network of the Caribs who inhabited the Lesser Antilles. The Caribs, like the European invaders, were a militant and imperial people who were in the process of establishing their hegemony in the Eastern Caribbean. So they're talking about how, you know, when the Europeans got here, they noticed how the Caribs were kind of like trying to invade the Arawaks. They did invade the Arawaks, and the Arawaks would have beef with them. They would tell them stories about how they had beef with the Caribs, and the Caribs were kind of like, you know, conquerors, you know. Their cultural matrix made any form of labor subjection by the Europeans very difficult. Duterte, the French missionary, is he a Huguenot, who was familiar with the Caribs, noted that they possessed an innate contempt for manual labor, which drove them to launch a full-scale guerrilla war against the Europeans. They won some battles and killed a large number of whites, but eventually over the 17th and 18th century they were defeated and eliminated by Anglo-French and Dutch military pressures. To clear the very forested land, initiate production, the English in the West Indies had therefore to look outwards for a labor supply. Like the French in the New World, they looked firstly to their homeland for this labor supply. And so just like the French did the same. What did the French do? When they needed a labor supply, they went to their country, France, or wherever they had colonies in Europe or wherever they were possessed, right? And they brought their homeland. They brought their own people over here, undesirables, convicts, same thing. And they didn't go to Africa. So what did the English do? They looked first in their homeland. They didn't go to Africa. They told us growing up that as soon as right away they went to Africa. They never told us anything about them going to their homeland in Europe to get slaves or labor supply, you know, when they want to sugarcoat it. The slave trade from Africa was not fully established in the early 17th century. There was no such thing as an African slave trade. And it never was established. That's the whole point. See, now, right now in this article, and most articles we read, they always want to say, well, this preceded, this was before. When did it actually start? Show me the sources. Show me the ships. Show me the voyages. Show me what country they went to. Show me what tribe they took. Show me what port they landed on, who they were sold to. All this stuff was recorded. Remember, this is the company. This is a business they're running. They don't take losses. They don't take risks. It's a business venture. So again, the slave trade from Africa was not fully established in the early 17th century. And it was a virtual monopoly of the Iberians and the Dutch. It was what? A monopoly from who? Iberians. Who's the Iberians? Iberians. They're talking about Iberia. Who owned Iberia? Who's the Iberians? Talking about Spain, right? Iberia is not just Spain and Portugal. It also includes a little bit of North Africa. A lot of the Mediterranean is Iberia. Iberians monopolizing. And the Dutch. The price of slave labor from Africa was prohibitively expensive, and the English were not familiar with black slavery as an institution, which made the dependence on British labor more complete. Again, what? The English was not what? Familiar with what? So-called black crayon color slavery, an institution which made the dependence on British labor more complete. They didn't know anything about that nonsense. They don't know nothing about Kunta Kinte or you know, any roots, you know, fictional stories. They don't know nothing about that. So they went to where logically where they can get their slave labor from, their homeland, and from the Indians locally. It was common practice in 17th century Britain for farmers to hire labor by the year for agriculture and artisan work. The most logical step was therefore to demand labor from England under temporary indenture, not for a year, but for anything between 3 to 10 years. The planters would pay the passage, feed, clothe, and shelter the servant in return for their labor. At the end of the indenture, the servant would be given a freedom due of £10 or a piece of land. It was legitimate and acceptable within the labor tradition of English society. All right, this is the real slavery right here, indentured servitude. Not remember, they would do things so you wouldn't get your land, so you wouldn't, be able to get your freedom dues. They extend your contract. You get trapped in this circle of indentured servitude, and that is what became chattel slavery, what we thought was slavery. In 1638, Peter Hay noted that a plantation in this place, Barbados, is worth nothing unless there be good store of hands upon it. These hands were shipped out from Britain, and white workers under indenture became the mainstay of the colony. In 1645, George Downing wrote to John Winthrop, governor of Massachusetts, "A man that will settle there, West Indies, must look to procure servants, which if you could get out of England for 6 or 8 or 9 years' time, only paying their passages, or at the most but some small above it, would do very well, for so you shall be able to do something upon a plantation." Again, where's the Africans? When you start reading real records, when you start going through all these colonial primary sources, you know what primary means, from people from those times, speaking personal accounts, talking about, hey, go to England, go here, go to Iberia, go here, go to France, go to Portugal, go here, go to Germany, Ireland, Scotland to get your slave labor. Biographical data can be used to illustrate the critical importance of indentured labor to agricultural development during this period. The careers of Henry Winthrop, the young son of famous John Winthrop of Groton and Suffolk and Puritan governor of Massachusetts, and Thomas Burney illustrate the important forces operating within the early Barbados plantation economy. All right. Winthrop arrived in Barbados during the tobacco boom of 1628 and wrote to his uncle, Thomas Phones, in October, stating that he, though intend God willing to stay here on the island called Barbados in the West Indies, and here I my servants to join in planting of tobacco. He soon realized that in order to continue in tobacco production, his plantation needed every year some 23 servants. He was satisfied that the importation of servants from England at a cost of £5 to £6 for the passage of £10 annually for food, clothes, and shelter was indeed money well spent. After his first crop reached London, he wrote to his father demanding more indentured servants in order to expand his plantation. All right, for what? For his plantations. And we grow ups, they put this idea that anything related to a slave plantation or a labor plantation or any plantation in the Caribbean, no matter what period of their their colonization, whether it was early, middle, or late, because they're telling us only early here, but no matter what, they always told us that plantation meant African slaves, meant that they were proving people of color there from Africa, bringing them across the Middle Passage. But the real Middle Passage was from Europe coming over here, and it was really Europeans, indentured servants, that they did this with in the beginning and continued. Then they continued, and they did it with the local people too, the indigenous people. And continuing in this article, and I want to read this part to you, and pay attention to this part. It says, the spread of sugar production throughout the West Indies demanded not only large sums of capital and technology, but also a considerable flow of labor with varying degrees of skill, from common field laborers to highly specialized artisans. By 17th century standards, the plantation was so sophisticated production unit, demanding a labor force more complex than, say, an English estate. The grinding, boiling, curing, refining, and distilling process of sugar manufacture demanded industrial machinery, which had to be assembled, maintained, and at times modified. All right, so check this out, what they're trying to tell you here. Now, when we think of plantation and sugar plantation, we just think of so-called black Africans, so-called black, right? Melanated Africans coming, and working in these plantations. But then we're not thinking about the whole production part of it, which also takes in grinding, the boiling, the curing, the refining, the distilling processes. All right, the assembly, the maintenance, the manufacturing, industrial machine to handle industrial machinery. Those are skills that some people may have more of based on their experience. Some people develop these skills from apprentices. Some people just develop these skills from working in a place like that for a number of years. Either way, a lot of these indentured servants had that experience and skills, and that was one of their things that they sold their service for. Their service was that skill. So again, what they're trying to let you know here is what they're about to tell you is that imagine you couldn't just bring anybody to just come work. You needed to bring somebody that actually knew this process, can help and manage and grinding and boiling and curing, refining, and distilling. All right, so not just anybody from some random place in Africa that never done this before could just come and do that. So what this meant, it says here that a labor force with basic literacy and familiarity with advanced industrial technology was necessary. A labor force that knew this, that had experience, was necessary in advanced industrial technology. In the early phase of sugar production, planters claimed that these qualities were rare in most Africans. Africans couldn't do this. You hear, this is a big one right here. I didn't write this. You got to think about that. That's logical right there. They needed people who were skilled in this. And they had them in England and Ireland. So why would they go get somebody that never has done it before in a place they never gone to before and risk getting people, risk drowning, risk getting their ships sank, risk not even getting anybody because they got to go kidnap them, right? But in England, they got the whole system set up for them. They got already the labor force separated and everything. The government is helping them bring these people over here. And they even say, these are skilled in this, these ones are skilled in that. So you got to choose from sometimes, maybe even pick specific indentured servants. Like, hey, can you send me some that have worked in these kind of companies or in these kind of fields, so they can come here with that experience and help us in this plantation. And that's what they did, and that's what they're letting you know here. And it was rare, and these planters were telling you it was rare to find these qualities in most Africans. And when they were present, though it politically necessary to suppress or eradicate them, as a result they became heavily dependent on white indentured servants to make the critical transition to sugar production. All right, now we're gonna dodge the hijack big time here, because they're gonna keep saying white only because these are Europeans they're bringing. It was only white people that was indentured servants, and that's not true. There's a lot of European melanated people coming over and working in these sugar plantations as well. We've already got that. We already know that, right? We know we got to open our horizons here. We got to dodge the hijack big time. Even though we're getting dropped, we just got some major drop. Then they bring us to a hijack a little bit, and maybe they do it unknowingly, and they're assuming only because they're Europeans that they're pale skin, and they're calling them white. But even though they were dependent on these indentured so-called white servants, right? For what? For the sugar, the critical transition to sugar production. The majority of planters found indentured servants qualitatively adequate for sugar production. The result was a very large increase in the demand for servants during the sugar boom of the late 1640s and early 1650s. The Civil War in England was critical in releasing a large number of laborers, and between 1645 and 1650, at least 8,000 servants joined the labor force. Remember, political prisoners, all these people who were losing these wars were being sent over here. And who were these people? By 1652, some 12,000 servants were employed in Barbados sugar production, not Africans. Governor Atkins noted that during the period of early sugar production, indentured servants did most of the work on the plantation. Again, Governor Atkins, all right, listen to all the Pan-Africans out there. It says here that Governor Atkins noted that during the period of early sugar production, indentured servants did most of the work on the plantation. These poor tradesmen and artificers from the British Isles, Atkins noted, were critical to the development of the sugar industry in the colony. Critical in the West Indies, they were critical in North America, all the colonies. So, real history, if you're starting to pay attention, this is how it really went down. It wasn't no African slaves. During the period of 1628 to 1655, indentured servants experienced a degrading form of servitude. They worked as field hands in gangs on the plantations. Again, gangs in the plantations. Who? Indentured servants, not Africans. Sugar production in both the Old and New Worlds had long been associated with slave labor, and servants found their working relationships in the West Indies more oppressive than anything they had experienced in Britain. Both, again, pale-skinned people and colored people, melanated people. They worked in gangs with their African counterparts. That just means colored. They worked in what gangs? With their colored counterparts under severe overseers. The evidence of servants working with slaves in the sugar fields is interesting because it became common in the 18th century to designate field work as nigger work. You see? It's interesting that eventually they try to make that and relate that to people of color, or that derogative word. Alright, so it wasn't. It's clearly that it wasn't. There's clearly, in all those Europeans, thousands and thousands of pale-skinned people that were in the plantations working in gangs. Field hands, gangs on the plantation. Property being treated like property. Slavery. Legon noted how servants worked as field hands on the sugar estates between 1647 and 1650. And concluded that they got a harder share of the work than the slaves who were worked lightly during the first 2 years of seasoning. The hours of field work were indeed long. West Indian planters operated on the sun-up till sundown rule, using all daylight hours to advance the plantation. Generally, the work was hard, the diet poor, and the overseers brutal in their discipline. In 1648, Legon worked on Col Montfort's plantation, which employed 28 servants and was able therefore to provide a first-hand account of their working lives. He noted, a primary source, he noted that when the servant ships arrived, the planters hurried abroad to inspect the white cargo. After the allotted time, remember, look at white, it's in parentheses. So remember when I talk about parentheses, the white cargo, because they're European. They just put them as white because they're European, but there's colored people included in that, people with dark complexions. After the allotted time, which was given to rural planters to travel into town, the sale began. It was a time of great activity in Bridgetown, as the auctions temporarily dominated the town's business. After making his purchases, the planter would send his new servants to the plantation with an overseer. On their arrival at the plantation, the servants had to build their huts in which they were to live over the period of their indentures, which ranged from 3 to 10 years. The next day, work began with the ringing of a bell at 6 a.m., according to Legon. So they had to build their own huts right away. If they resist, their times are doubled. And if they complain, they are beaten by the overseers. So you see how these people were being treated, right? So it's not just a Kunta Kinte story. In 1655, one observer noted that in spite of the large number of colored slaves on the island, the custom of all merchants trading thither is to bring as many men and women as they can. No sooner does ship come to anchor than the islanders go abroad inquiring what servants they can buy. These servants planteth, weedeth, and maneuvereth the ground all by hand, in which lies their estates. During the 1630s and 1640s, planters kept gangs of female servants that weed and do common work about the plantations, but after the 1670s, female servants were not allowed in the field. They were kept primarily for domestic and sexual functions. Again, for what? For domestic and what? Sexual functions. Field servants were divided into 3 basic groups. Firstly, there was a group of subordinate overseers who worked part of each gang and were responsible for making sure that each daily task was completed. Secondly, there were the gangs of common servants who did most of the field work with the slaves. Thirdly, there were the gangs of common women who performed work about the plantations. I want to read from this article now. It's called A Righteous and Unruly Lot, Irish Indentured Servants and Freemen in the English West Indies, 1644 to 1730 by Hilary McD. Beckles. And this is from the William and Mary Quarterly, volume 47, number 4, October 1990. You can find this on pages 503 to 522, about 20 pages. Again, A Righteous and Unruly Lot, Irish Indentured Servants and Freemen in the English West Indies. Remember, Irish in all those islands that were being populated for the sugar plantations. Well, Irish was one of them. It says here, 17th century English planters in the West Indies, like their mainland counterparts, just like the ones in North America, established plantations with white indentured servants. Like them, they had to control or suppress the unruly behavior of disgruntled servants and landless ex-servants or freemen. All right, so continuing further down in the article, starts talking about, the convicts and the political prisoners. So it says Barbados was the favorite West Indian dumping ground for political prisoners during the Commonwealth. On September 15, 1649, after the Battle of Drogheda, Oliver Cromwell informed John Bradshaw, president of the council, that the enemy were about 3,000. They made a stout resistance, but those who escaped with their lives are in safe custody for the Barbados. They're ready to be sent to the Barbados. In October 1655, he ordered that all English, Scots, and Irish prisoners in Dorchester jail be forthwith sent to Barbados. All right, convicts. In addition to political prisoners, many hundred of Irish were legally defined by the state as social undesirables and transported to the West Indies. So that if they said, oh, they don't like you, or they see you look kind of funny, kind of poor, you're walking around like, he's an undesirable. I don't desire him. I don't desire that guy. So he got sent because I don't desire that guy. He got labeled and not desirable, and he got transported to the West Indies to help meet the insatiable demand for sugar planters for labor. All right, we just got the other article about sugar plantations. Same thing. And again, not Africans they're supplying these plantations with. Transporting such people had begun with the English corps under the Charles I. Cromwell's regime carried out the practice on a far larger scale with the Irish. In 1654, for example, governors of several Irish counties received orders to arrest all wanderers, men and women, in such orders other Irish within their precincts as shall not prove they had such a settled course of industry as yielded them a means of their own to maintain them. All such children were in hospitals or workhouses, all prisoners, men and women, to be transported to the West Indies. You hear this? And you think all these people were pale-skinned? Why is the West Indies so dark complexion then? Wouldn't there be more descendants of these so-called whites, pale Europeans? Even though there is today, we do find, like Irish descendants and all that, and we do know the story of Indentured Servants, and we think it was just part of it, and just no. They were also colored people that looked just like people from Africa coming in, but they were Irish, they were Scott, they were German, and these people eventually were classified as Negro people, mixed in with all the other people of color. And just real quick, I'm not going to read from it, but just want to remind everybody about this book, and that there is records of these indentured servants being brought over here. This is a book called The Original List of Persons of Quality: Immigrants, Religious Exiles, Political Rebels, Servant Men sold for a term of years, apprentices, children stolen. They even admit they stole children, maidens pressed, and others who went from Great Britain to the American plantations from 1600 to 1700 with their ages, the localities where they formerly lived in the mother country, England, not Africa, the names of the ships in which they embarked, and other interesting particulars. From Ms. preserved in the State Papers Department of Her Majesty's Public Record Office in England, edited by John Camden Houghton. This is to the members of the Genealogical and Historical Societies of the United States of America. This collection of the names of the emigrant ancestors of many thousands of American families that came in here like indentured servants is respectfully dedicated by the editor John Camden Houghton. And this is just an example of the contents in this book. It basically is a list or a muster or a census, as they call it, list of ships conveying immigrants to Virginia before 1625 to 6 mentioned in, right? Even before, look at that. This is just the ones from 1625 to 26. Look at this. The Abigail, Ambrose, Anne, Blessing, Bonanova, Hercules, Hopewell, Jacob, James, Jonathan. These are ships. Swan, the Tiger, the Treasure, the Warwick, all right, the Flying Heart, the Falcon, the Elizabeth, the Mary, the Margaret. All right, that's one of the ships that Anthony's wife came on, and she was listed as a Negro. The Negro Mary and the Margaret, that was his wife. She was a Negro from England. This ship was coming from England, not Africa. All right, so we showed that, and we read from this book in the last content. I just wanted to remind you, that it's in here. They even list all the rebels they have here and sent to Barbados, all that we just read. Of the Ebony magazine from 1969, one observes with interest that the white planners commented at length on the racial characteristics of the various tribes of white people. All right, the various tribes of the white people. What are they talking about? Japhetic tribe? What are they talking about here? Most observers said the Scotch and the German servants were the best and that the Irish were the worst. One must remember, however, that the evidence comes almost entirely from the white upper class. The servant, like the slave, left few records to tell his side of the story. From the very beginning, white servants conspired and attempted to revolt, but most of these conspiracies and revolts were betrayed by favored white servants. It is interesting to note that white historians use the same conceptual apparatus in their explanation of the number of white and black revolts. For example, Abbott Emerson Smith says, we got his book already, right? A disposition to general rebellion seems scarcely to have existed among servants on the continent, perhaps because the chance of success was negligible as compared with that on a relatively small island. Be that as it may, the fact remains that the white planners lived in constant fear of a united rebellion by blacks, whites, and reds. To forestall that possibility, they systematically sowed the seeds of division. The most common form of resistance was flight. Throughout the colonial period, newspapers were filled with reports of absconding servants. Some of the reports indicated that whites and blacks ran away together. In the matter of runaways, there was absolutely no difference between the institutions of slavery and servitude. The same mechanisms were used to capture servants and slaves, and the advertisements indicated that the servants wore collar chains and were scarred and maimed by cruel treatment. All right, they're letting you know true history. Remember, we've read a lot of these newspaper ads, with servants, same way. They're letting you know, just like a regular slave or a lifelong indentured servant who's doing a lifetime term of indenture, basically being treated like chattel, are described in the same way. They're described in the same way. Again, it's telling you here, wearing collars around their neck, with marks on their body, branded, scarred, maimed by cruel treatment. The same way. Although there were periodic demands for the emancipation of white people, the system of white servitude survived in America until the third decade of the 19th century. Again, what? The third decade? We're talking about 1800s? 19th century? 1800s, they were still bringing what? European indentured servants. They were still so-called pale-skinned white people as indentured servants. White servitude survived in America until the third decade of the 19th century. So where's all the Africans? Even the Revolutionary War, with its rhetoric of liberty and equality, failed to free the white bondsmen of America. As a matter of fact, some white Americans claimed at the time that keeping white servants was a part of the inalienable rights of mankind. In 1778, a revolutionary committee from Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, adopted the following words: resolved that all apprentices and servants are the property of their masters and mistresses, and every mode of depriving such masters and mistresses of their property is a violation of the rights of mankind. This claim and others of like tone and tenor reflected the economic and social importance of the institution of white servitude. Throughout the 17th century and part of the 18th century, white servitude was the major economic prop of most of the colonies. All right? Again, throughout the 17th century, we're talking about 1600s, and part of the 18th century, talking about 1700s, white servitude was the major. That was the origin. That was who was really white, not white, but European servitude, European indentured servants. We're talking about both colored and white as well, though. We're including them too. We know they were servants, slaves too. They were a major economic prop for most of the colonies. As the years wore on, the limited supply of white servants and the changing economic needs of the English and colonial power structures shifted the spotlight to Africa. All right, so dodge the hijack big time. They're talking about colored people. It shifted to colored people, not Africa. And they just told us before that they were importing, right, all the way up to the 19th century, 1800s. So what do you mean, the lack of? But by the time white servants had left an indelible mark on the economic and social fabric of America. To cite only one example, white servitude helped create the landed aristocracy of the South. You heard that? White servitude helped what? Create the landed aristocracy of the South. The system of indentured service and its social effects, Philip Bruce said, differed but little, if at all, from the system of slavery. It differed little of what you think slavery was. It really accentuated the social divisions among the whites more distinctly than the presence of the institution of slavery did. The indentured servants were as much a legalized lower class in Virginia as the noblemen were legalized higher class in England. It gave purely class distinctions a recognized standing in the colonial courts of law. It was not until the end of the century that Negro bondsmen became numerous on the plantations, and yet in social spirit, the 17th century in Virginia did not differ from the 18th. All right, it was the same still in the 18th. The ever-increasing multitude of colored slaves after 1700 simply confirmed the social tendencies, they wanted colored people, social tendencies which had previously been fostered by the presence of the indentured whites or indentured Europeans. American history and American historians have not been kind to the memory of the poor white founding fathers. All right, they have not told you real history. And these founding fathers have a history, and I've already shown you a couple of them as indentured servants or have a history in that. Although a handful of indentured whites rose to prominence in the social and economic fields, and two freed white men signed the Declaration of Independence. Again, what? Two freed white men, they were slaves, two freed white men signed the Declaration of Independence. We're going to get into who's they're talking about in future video. There has been a tendency to shunt indentured servants to the cellar of national life. For example, some historians say openly that it was fortunate that so many indentured servants fell by the wayside. T.J. Wertenbaker wrote, as years went on, the scarcity of women became a distinct blessing, for it made it impossible for the degraded laborer, even though he ultimately secured his freedom, to leave descendants to perpetuate his lowly instincts. Abbott Emerson Smith wrote, perhaps it was a fortunate thing that pioneers' conditions were as difficult as they were, if there is any truth in theories of heredity, for that weak, diseased, and unenterprising were not preserved. The strong and competent survived, and if this manner of separating sheep from goats put too great a premium on sheer physical health, that at least was something well worth distinguishing and preserving. There was speedy winnowing of the vast influx of riff-raff which descended on the settlements. The residue, such as it was, became the American people. The residue of the residue, right? The residue. You're the residue. You're today the residue of these indentured Europeans, what you call white Americans, and the black, so-called black European indentured servant descendants, is the residue of what became the American people. But this is mixture with what the indigenous people, they're leaving out of that. All right, these views, harsh and unimaginative, should be placed against the background of the undoubted contributions of the poor white founding fathers. Although some men would like to forget them, the record burns with their presence and reminds us that America, such as it is, was conceived not in liberty, but in the forced labor of reds, blacks, and whites. All right? Boom. Not just blacks, so-called blacks, BLM. It's not just blacks. This ain't crayon colors. We're talking about people. We're talking about people of different nations being separated by complexion and eventually being called what? Reds, blacks, and whites. Crayon colors. And again, That was a great article because all that I can verify, and I have verified, and we have verified it together. If you've watched the first 3 parts of this series, White Servitude, and many other videos I have from before regarding the statute laws of the American Indians and indentured servitude, right? Same thing was happening to the Aboriginals as they were being put under indenture as well. So again, this was from Ebony Magazine from 1969. Who would have thought, November 1969, who would have thought that somebody from Ebony Magazine would write an article of white servitude and corroborate everything that I have been reading and learning, and we've been presenting in the last 3 videos, right? This is real history, and this person knew what he was talking about, all right? This is a person of color, most likely, hopefully, right? I don't know what if they employed only colored people in Ebony, but I'm assuming that they did, and I'm assuming he was, and he did his homework on this article called Bound Over, Indentured Servitude and American Conscience by John Van Dersey. In the book, in this part of the book, introduction, just to finish it up, and it goes into basically the point I was saying earlier about the American Revolution and who these people really were. And right before I read this, they explain how it really wasn't about really caring about people. It was more of a political thing. But what were they really fighting if they all they talk about is slavery and tyranny and all this stuff and being free and liberty? Who were they talking about? Were they talking about? They weren't talking about just the so-called negro, because they had slaves. Remember, these people had indentured servants. They didn't care really about that. So it says here, why were the acts of the colonial authorities and of parliament so often linked by colonial speakers and pamphleteers? So people in media, like the people in the media, right, or in publishing and making the books, commercial ads, advertisements. All right, so why would these speakers, motivational speakers, public speakers, pamphleteers, Samuel Adams, John Adams, James Otis, Thomas Jefferson, John Dickinson, Stephen Hopkins, Joseph Galloway, with slavery and tyranny? There was only one British practice which could and did actually subject colonial men and women to tyranny and enchantment. So they're saying there was only one real reason what they were really fighting, and it was basically, in that time, the only thing that existed was indentured servitude that kind of affected colonial people. It didn't just affect so-called African slaves, right? Because we're learning, right, that it's all Europeans that it was affecting. So these people are being affected by that. And this is the main thing they were fighting for. Their cause was the whole indentured servitude system. The experience of servitude was both widespread and intensely personal. The practice was present, at least at settlement stages, in every colony. Again, in every colony, since the very beginning, they're saying at least, no, all the way up until the 1800s. We already know that. We read this before. All right, so this was there since the early stages of the colonies. The most prosperous colonies, Virginia and Pennsylvania, were economically founded on it. They were founded, Virginia and Pennsylvania was because of indentured servitude, not because of African slavery. They didn't owe it to African slavery, their establishment. It was because of the indentured servitude system. Moreover, the uprooting and transplanting of people to the New World. When we mean people, they mean Europeans, usually occurring in youth, in some cases in childhood, involving the separation from parents, brothers, sisters, and a home, produced, as we shall see over and over again, the kind of emotional trauma that individuals never entirely escape and whose effects resounded through the decades. No other colonial experience was so common and at the same time so profound. Basically, they didn't care about no African slaves or people of color or people coming from Africa. That was not the real reason of the whole American Revolution and freedom or even the Civil War, any of that. All right, these people were going through their own indentured servitude. A lot of these people were indentured servants / slaves. That's the hijack. Thus, people with dissimilar and sometimes conflicting interests could be united into a common opposition that focused and directed their deepest energies and frustrations against a single target, The old world hierarchy extended to the new, the transporting authority under which they had been brought over, in which they were brought over under. They were under this system of indentured servitude. This is how they got here as slaves. They were brought over here as slaves, as indentured servitudes from the old world. Yeah, so-called old world. This is the true old world. But they mean England, right? Their mother country, which continued to rule them with potentially arbitrary power of a servant's master, and which, in order to be truly autonomous individuals, they would have to discard. All right, so they would have to get rid of that system, is what he's saying. That indentured servitude, that's what they were really fighting for, the Revolutionary War. And you know what? They even use indentured servants to do that. It's so ironic, right? On both sides.